Good evening. Welcome to Center Place. Welcome to our history, philosophy, theology series. Normally, this is a lecture series, but tonight we're doing something a little different where we are simply going to have a long dialogue, a Q&A, where you guys are going to essentially ask me anything. And I will do my best to answer those kinds of questions. Mike and Jeannie are here in the comments. Mike is going to be assembling your questions, and Jeannie is going to be moderating the chat. And so we'll do our very best to get at all the questions. And like I say, I'm going to do my best in terms of answering them. I'm sure that you guys will have stuff to throw at me that I won't be able to answer, and that'll be fine as well. And so let's go ahead and start right in. James Sweeney has asked, do you have an opinion? Thank you, Mike. Do you have an opinion on the rise of biblical literalism, such as the kind practiced by the Jehovah's Witnesses? It's my understanding that this kind of literalism is rooted in the sola scriptura tradition of Protestant philosophy, but it seems to have vastly expanded during the Third and Fourth Great Awakening, particularly in the United States. Do you think biblical literalism is a natural path that emerges with the diversity of Protestant thought, or is there some socioeconomic, philosophical, or historical factors at play, like the rise of modern apocalypticism, William Miller, the Great Disappointment, from which the Jehovah's Witness is traced their roots? That's a fantastic question, James. I think you, in part, are a little bit answering your own question, because I think you're seeing some of the things, I think, where this is emerging. So I've talked in other lectures about my view that the way that the Bible is understood, the way that it is central, let's say nowadays in 21st century Christianity, is an entirely different experience than any Christians would have had through centuries of what Christianity was about. And so through antiquity and all through the Middle Ages, when the vast majority of Christians were not literate, when there wasn't a printing press and you couldn't have had access to Bibles, when Bibles were written essentially for almost all Christians in a language that they wouldn't know, a language that where literacy was only part of the kind of the clerical elite, and they also were reading a liturgical language. So you might be speaking some kind of medieval Anglo-Saxon or medieval French, medieval Norman, and the clerics are reading in Latin, and so something like that. So as a result, you can imagine this kind of modern relationship that so many Christians have with the Bible. That's an alien and new thing. And one of the natural factors that have emerged is this getting rid of a filter, getting rid of having what we might call it an educated elite, but we also might just call it instead let's say, an educated class, a class that has been grounded in understanding that this text is ancient, that it has a historical context. It can't simply be read literally on its surface as if, without any understanding of any context. It's very, very alien. That kind of gets thrown out the door when you popularize everything, when you democratize everything and just put it in everybody's hands without any kind of a guidebook. And so yes, I'd say on the one hand, to your point, the fact that Protestantism specifically eliminated all of the other forms of authority that had been the pillars of Christianity. So tradition being one of the most important ones, apostolic succession, which is another kind of tradition, and also the interpretation of the church fathers, which is to say what people have said who have thought about this before. All of that was wiped away, and now sola scriptura, the scripture, is the only source of authority. And now it's being read by people, in many cases, that don't have an academic background or anything about scriptural or literary criticism or anything like that. And so they read it and they misunderstand it, they misinterpret it. And so yes, modern fundamentalism is one of the results of that, and the Jehovah's Witnesses are a group like that. The LDS Church, the Mormon Church, also has that kind of literal reading, but evangelicals, modern evangelicals, Protestants, there's lots of churches that do that, and that same kind of fundamentalism occurs across Abrahamic religions. So there's a lot of that in Islam and also even Judaism. And so I think that that's where this modern thing has arisen. I kind of think that for Protestants, it's like you teach kids some Bible stories in Sunday school. They grow up and they don't have the deep academic tradition, and they just teach it that same way. And then a lot of people say, well, wait a second, none of those things happened, or this is not, and they think that that's what the religion is, and it's not, or it shouldn't be. But that's how it's emerged, especially, like you say, after the Great Awakenings in the North America. General Now asks, where did Center Place's logo come from? So if you're here with us on YouTube, you're seeing in our little icon over there, there is a kind of a spiral. And so that spiral is our logo for Center Place. Center Place is the church building that I transmit from. So you can see behind me, there's a spiral on the wall. We use the spiral as one of our symbols in my church, in my movement. So my denomination of Christianity is called Community of Christ. And the symbol of the spiral we use as to mean, it's sometimes called the worshiper's path or the path of the disciple. The idea of it is that as we are going through life, we are hopefully also, life has these cycles where things recur, good and bad, but hopefully we are learning from those and we're ascending. And so the spiral sort of represents that journey through life, the inward path and even the outward path. And our headquarters of the denomination is a temple that is dedicated to peace in Independence, Missouri, and it takes the form of a spiral. If you Google it, Community of Christ Temple, Independence, Missouri, you'll see how that looks like, and that's also where the symbol comes from. Specifically in the denomination as well, we have 5 mission initiatives, each of which have a little logo. So a cross for us is invite people to Christ, invite people into sacred community. And the spiral means engage in missional activity in your congregation, live life meaningfully together. So it means live life meaningfully together to us. Jeff Howell asks, Mormon, the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon within the Book of Mormon, chapter 9, verse 22 to 24, is copied word for word from the King James Version of Mark 16, 15 through 18. And Jeff asks, what basis exists to give the Book of Mormon legitimacy compared to other books? So Jeff, when we do literary criticism and textual criticism in the Bible and so on, we will point out that one of the main things that we can do in literary criticism is literary dependence. And so that's how we talk about, for example, the synoptic problem in the Gospels, where we know between the Gospels that we call Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that there is a literary dependence. Two of these authors are copying from each other, or they're copying from a common source. Something is going on where it's not just multiple eyewitnesses, there is a literary dependence. And that's usually most commonly solved by scholars with the two-source hypothesis. And so we've had lectures about the two-source hypothesis and the Q sayings gospel and so forth. So into the case of the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon is absolutely literarily dependent on the King James Version of the Bible. So the Book of Mormon, whereas many people have as a faith proposition that the Book of Mormon was an ancient text and it preserves a independent tradition of biblical statements. So in this case, you're quoting from Mark, and so we're talking about a New Testament quotations from Jesus and so forth. I haven't looked up, I'm just doing this here, I haven't looked up the particular passage that you have. But what we're more or less saying is that this is not an independent tradition at all, and actually we can tell through literary analysis that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century text and the King James Bible is its source. So it means it's a modern text. It was composed by Joseph Smith. Eisen Meme asks, as an atheist who has come to believe that sentience is defined as an awareness of personal existence between the twin abysses of non-existence, before birth and after death, I wonder what importance do you place on the belief in an afterlife, in heaven or hell? I much appreciate these lectures as giving insight into both Community of Christ and the Christian religion in general. Please keep up the good work. Thanks, Eisen Meme. So you're asking it a couple different ways because you're asking what importance do I personally believe? I am personally not too worried about the concept of afterlife, and I am actually very focused in my life and my ministry on what are we doing in this life? How are we living life meaningfully in community here and now? And in my own personal belief system is, when you're talking about the time period, this time segment of your existence, birth till death, and there's abyss on either side for you, non-existence. What I would suggest to me, what my position on that is that on either side, we're talking about something that is totally beyond or totally different from what our existence is in a way that we couldn't understand it or even think of it. So I know that there are a bunch of Christians, a bunch of people in their Abrahamic religions who think of afterlife as being fundamentally just more of the same of this life, and I don't see it that way. I would see it as being a very different experience or non-experience, something that is not comparable. And in terms of heaven and hell, we have done lectures on it. I think that the literal idea of a hell, would take any of these kind of ideas understood literalistically are just going to lead you into kind of error. And the way we define in Community of Christ heaven and hell is essentially separateness from or connection to the divine, God who is good and goodness and love for love's own sake. And so to the extent that you are self-alienated from that which is good, then you are in a condition of hell or in sin, and that God's grace is infinite and you can always turn and back towards that connection of at one-ment with the eternal source of goodness. And so that would be more of I would say therefore a symbolic understanding or meaningful understanding of heaven and hell as opposed to a literalistic understanding of heaven and hell. And so that's, I think, how we teach it in Community of Christ. And I also kind of shared therefore my own not particular worry about it. I'm not, I know there's a lot of people who are very worried about mortality. In the same way that I think that, it's the Epicureans who are trying to teach you that, you weren't worried about, if it is just non-existence and non-existence, you weren't worried about non-existence before you existed, and why should you worry about non-existence after you don't anymore? It's not something that we need to spend our time or waste our time, if it is limited, worrying about. Let me see if I can control this yet. So this mouse is not. Oh, do what? Oh, okay. Oh, I see. It is working now. Thank you, Mike. So now I have control of the questions. Thank you. Rai the King asks, what are John's thoughts on the Marsaba letter and the idea of secret mark? Yeah, I have very mixed opinions on secret mark. So the idea of it is that a very well-respected biblical scholar in the last half century was able to find a letter, a copy of an otherwise unknown letter from Clement, where Clement talks about condemning a gospel that exists among a heretical group as far as Clement and the proto-Orthodox are concerned, and that they have a gospel of a secret mark, which they claim is the real one, and they've actually modified it to include bad teachings, or supposedly. And it's a very interesting, and I think that's the kind of thing that Clement and other proto-Orthodox leaders are talking about, and having variations of gospels is something that is very, very reasonable. The problem is that the source of this went missing, and so I think we don't have the idea of it is we don't have the original, and so we have primarily just what the scholar himself wrote about it and that kind of a thing. And so I don't really know necessarily what to make of it. I guess I would probably presume that maybe the letter is genuine, but it doesn't actually reflect an earlier version of Mark, as has sometimes been hypothesized, but maybe the most likely thing is that there is just a variation within Mark. But again, I don't think we can say conclusively. Mario Garcia asks, why were the Gnostics within Christian churches meeting in private to learn Gnostic ideas while keeping the rest of their congregations in darkness? What was the purpose of not letting others in the church know? So this is in reference to the multiple early Christianities, whereas some of the early groups were completely separate from one another. So proto-Orthodox communities had congregations that were separate, and even a hierarchy that was separate from, for example, the Marcionites, who organized a separate community, or were in conflict with each other. And likewise, we think that some of the Jewish law-observing communities are wholly separate from some of the proto-Orthodox communities, whereas within proto-Orthodox communities, for example, maybe there's a regular proto-Orthodox congregation meeting in Alexandria in Egypt. There might be some members within that community that have, let's say, their own little Bible study group where they have some Gnostic texts which they pass around with each other, and they allow themselves to feel like, well, we have the true gnosis, we have the true knowledge, we have the additional information that the rest of the people in the congregation don't have. And so there's a couple reasons why I think that they do that. One is, if they told everybody that they were doing that, they could get in trouble, and so it would be potentially, you could potentially get kicked out of the church, and you would have this fight like the Marcionites were having with the proto-Orthodox. But the other half of it, kind of philosophically, is that the Gnostics actually are a little bit elitist. I think that they think in some cases, not all of them, but some of them feel like that not everybody has the divine spark in them, and there's an elect community that is being kind of pulled out and are actually elevated up, and so you're in this kind of important inner circle that's been called to have this light that the other people that are around you who are kind of corrupted from part of the corrupted material world that maybe they cared for. They wouldn't. It's like casting pearls before swine kind of thing. So I think that that's kind of why, two reasons why the Gnostics went about that way. Michael Rogers says, you've previously stated that you see the historical Jesus as more of a wise sage. Could we draw some conclusions about him from the Ebionite religion or the text handed down from oral history? So we have the different communities that emerge from the movement, sometimes called the Jesus movement. So, but I think even the Jesus movement is saying a little too much. There is a movement that involves John the Baptist, that involves Jesus, that involves Jesus' brother James. So all of those sort of folks are part of a movement that is a Jewish sect that is very much drawn from members of people who are born into the Jewish religion living in Galilee and Judea. They're initially Jesus anyway and his family are from Galilee, but they are eventually kind of located in Jerusalem. And we talk about later. We later have evidence of the Ebionites, as they're called, which are Jewish law observing Christians. And Ebionite is understood to come from the Hebrew word for poor. And Paul talks about gathering money for the poor of Jerusalem. And so a hypothesis is that this group, which emphasizes poverty, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom, that this mendicant group, people who are kind of living like, very ancient Franciscan friars or like Buddhists or something like that, that represents this Jesus group. So, and then I've said before that, okay, how do we understand the historical Jesus within that group? And I have said things like, well, as opposed to somebody who thinks he's the Messiah and is going around saying that in his actual lifetime, the historical Jesus' actual lifetime, which is what perhaps a zealot or a revolutionary might be saying, that instead he is going around teaching people by persuasion even, not by making authoritative statements, thus saith the Messiah, this and that. Here he says, he tries to convince you with arguments that are based on reason and that kind of thing and telling parables. And so that is my kind of why I sort of picture the historical Jesus that way. In terms of trying to draw conclusions about him from what we know from the Ebionite religion, it's very hard because we do not have we don't have their texts. We only have a couple fragments. And so unfortunately, as you know, we don't have, for example, anything that it would be from that Jesus group directly. So nothing of the earliest texts are in Aramaic, which would have been the language that they're speaking. And we also don't have anything from people who directly knew the historical Jesus. So we have only people who knew the historical Jesus. So we have people like Paul who knew Jesus' brother. So we have that kind of writing, or knew Jesus' apostle. And so as a result of that, it is very hard. So the reconstruction that I've given is kind of what we can say about him, and we then have to decide, well, how many of these sayings that we have in the Greek, so in the New Testament tradition, how many of those are authentic and can have their roots in the historical Jesus? And as we sort of try to figure that puzzle out using the tools of literary criticism, that's how we can the picture of Jesus as a wise sage emerges. However, because you have to prioritize different ideas in those criteria, this is why I've said there are multiple competing academically defensible models that you can draw. So, Bart Ehrman has very much done all that and concluded, well, Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet, and that's how he has concluded. So it depends on that. We are going to have a lecture in the next couple months on which of Jesus' sayings are authentically drawn, can authentically be traced to the historical Jesus, and how are we, what are the criteria that scholars use in order to try to make those conclusions? And so we're going to have a lecture on that within the next 2 months. Fire Ever Living asks, what message should we take from the book of Ecclesiastes? So that's interesting. So this is an Old Testament book, of course, that is part of the Hebrew wisdom literature, but Ecclesiastes is there are different strains within the wisdom literature. So there's the kind of wisdom literature like the Book of Proverbs, which kind of just tells you good aphorisms that more or less says if you do all the right things, you'll be healthy, wealthy, and wise, and all that kind of thing. Ecclesiastes is a more sophisticated sage, the author of Ecclesiastes, who understands you can do X, Y, and Z right things, and you will not necessarily end up being healthy, wealthy, and wise, because we can do everything right, and you could still, get terminal cancer or something like that. And so the author of Ecclesiastes, is on record as saying, therefore, if all of these different things, everything is vanity, which is to say it's vain as we are having these kind of traditions. And we just had talked about in Afterlife, the author of Ecclesiastes says, that's a vain hope. Essentially, the author of Ecclesiastes more or less says that, dogs die and they don't have souls that go to heaven, and why should you think humans do? I mean, I'm paraphrasing the idea, but I mean, that kind of a thing. And there's other places where we hear you only have the time under the sun, and so you should essentially have an Epicurean philosophy of, being happy with your lot in life, making sure that you are enjoying each day as you're living it, and that kind of a thing. It's a more complicated book than all of that, and in fact, actually, we are going to have a whole lecture on Ecclesiastes on April 4th. And so, anyway, we'll dive into it in more detail then, but it's a very interesting text. I guess what message should we take away from it? The message we should take away is that the Bible is a library of voices that are actually, in some cases, arguing with each other. They do not agree with each other, and so we can't just quote the Bible and say, well, that's the end of the discussion. Rather, the Bible, because it has different competing viewpoints, is something that is inviting us into dialogue. So, let's see if I can go back to having this. Yes, I can. Meredith Kerr says, you make a lot of references to pop culture media like The Simpsons, which I love. Thank you, I love The Simpsons. So if you had to live your life in one fan universe or show, what would it be? I'm trying to think if I'm going to, certainly not The Simpsons. That would not be fun. I don't want to live in, well, I guess nothing ever really goes wrong. It all resets itself in Springfield, but they are very close at different times to a nuclear meltdown or having a comet hit them or any other thing. From earliest childhood, I've been a lifelong Star Trek fan. I have an incurable optimism for the future, and I would like things to be going towards that kind of a future where we can, at least, it's not in all the planets, but in the Federation, abolish poverty and end unnecessary suffering, where we have, if we could eventually get to that place in the future where there is an abundant source of energy that would allow us not to degrade the environment or cause needless even animal suffering in order to just meet all of our basic needs, where you don't have to have any fight over possessions because you could have them, anything you need, be materialized. And so therefore the point of life will now come to a place where you're saying, you have to really want to live into it. So what is meaningful? How can we enrich ourselves? How can we do deep introspection about life's meaning, all of those kind of things. So that would be where I guess I would want to live, is further afield Star Trek, so into the next generation times. Todd Radmaker says, in your opinion, were the Ebionites the original old school followers who died out for not conforming to Christianity? That would be my interpretation, Todd, actually. I mean, I think that it's a little speculative because we can't know too much about it, but it does seem to me that that the original, let's say, the original kind of movement that Jesus is a part of is a Jewish sect. They are people that are speaking Aramaic. They are continuing to follow Jewish law. And then it's only after Jesus has died, is crucified, and when Paul and other new leaders have emerged, that they argue and make the case and ultimately are able to say that we don't have to follow Jewish law, and that's the separating point. And so then once they did that, then the community stayed and continued to say, well, we think we do need to continue to observe Jewish law, and over time then that opinion and that practice became a tiny minority within Christianity, and it was ultimately deemed as heretical. And so that's, and then like you say, it died. It was stamped out for not conforming then to the main line that had emerged. I want to, in between questions, we have had a lot of people who have supported us and contributed specifically to Center Place lectures. And that allows us to devote our time and for me to do all the reading and make all of the slides, and for us to do this. And so I want to thank people, I'm going to do this in between questions, different of you who have donated. So Andy Lyon, Nancy Motian from Leggett, California, David Anderson from Washington, D.C., Anna Gold from Chino, California, and Anthony Rosario from Las Vegas, Nevada, Robert Christopher from San Pablo, California, Victor Platon from Bucharest, Romania, Antti Turpainen from Finland, Diane Phelps, and Thomas Younts. So Edo River asks, let me see if I can do this. Yes. Related to Leo Tolstoy and his influence in Christianity, are you familiar with the set of beliefs about Christianity held by Leo Tolstoy? What is his status as a religious philosopher in Western Christianity? Does he have any influence with modern Western theologians? So my understanding is, that Tolstoy, after writing his most famous books like War and Peace and Anna Karenina, that Tolstoy, who was a Christian, began to focus his writing on developing Christian philosophy, and specifically he was a very committed pacifist, a total pacifist, even like an anarcho-pacifist, which is kind of a radical, non-violent ideology. And he expressed it to the extent that I think he got in trouble with the Orthodox Church and may have been excommunicated, if I'm not mistaken. So in this sense, I would just say Tolstoy is then probably in that same stream of thinkers and activists, like Thoreau or Martin Luther King Jr., who believe in a pacifism, but also an active pacifism, so revolution through nonviolence, and that stream of Christianity. And so I would think that he is still influential as part of that stream. Julie Bazuski says, as a left-center Catholic, I have found your lectures on the Restoration tradition quite fascinating. Can you explain why Joseph Smith included so many Old Testament aspects in his religion? It's an interesting development, Julie. So Joseph Smith and the other early members of the church, when they got together, they were what we call Restorationists, and they were actually part of a broader Restoration movement in Protestantism from that time period, the Second Great Awakening, early 19th century American Christianity, Protestant Christianity. And the goal of Restorationism is like even Protestantism on steroids, which is to say they want to not just reform the Christian church, the Catholic Church, as the Reformation wanted to do. They wanted to restore the ancient practices that they read about in the New Testament. And so when the church gets started, they're literally reading the book of Acts, they're reading the letters of Paul, they're trying to do things only based on what they can read about in the New Testament. And so it is very focused on that. And that ends up being other Restoration churches like the Disciples of Christ, which come from the same kind of time and place, they continue to have that focus. But Joseph Smith keeps going. And so as you say, pretty quickly, they get their idea that there are problems with the Old Testament, and they think that the problems that they see in the Old Testament must come from transmission errors. So they must have happened sometime in the Middle Ages, as the monks are copying these books, that, as Joseph Smith said, the plain and precious parts of the Bible have been corrupted or removed, and so on. They're not really correct. The transmission process is pretty good, actually, as we now know. But they thought that at the time, and so believing in continuing revelation, they wanted to correct these and fix these, and so Joseph Smith begins work on what gets later called like the new translation of the Bible, what we call now the Joseph Smith Bible revision. And so there starts to fix things. And so essentially a lot of them are ideas like you go to the Exodus, and during the plagues, there's this horrible plague and everybody in Egypt is suffering. And then it says in the book of Exodus, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart that he would not let the people go. Well, so that was made perfect sense to the original authors of the Pentateuch way back in ancient times, because they don't have the sense of free will and modern individualism. Pharaoh is not a person. Pharaoh is an agent that God uses in order to test his people. But for modern post-Enlightenment people, this is a horrible violation of free will. You're going to punish the Egyptians and punish Pharaoh, and it's God is the one that's actually making the choice here, because God's the one that's hardening Pharaoh's heart, it's not a choice that Pharaoh's making. And so Joseph Smith corrects that. And so in the Joseph Smith Bible revision, it says, and Pharaoh hardened his heart that he would not let the people go. And so that's where he starts to get involved in, trying to rethink Old Testament stuff, and that kind of goes that way. But like you say, it didn't start with that. It starts with a New Testament focus, but after starting to read the Old Testament a lot and get more interested in it, then that changes the Latter-day Saint Restoration tradition and makes it quite different then from, like, say, the Disciples of Christ Restoration tradition. Valda Puing says, you say Exodus is a myth, therefore religion is a myth, correct? So that's one of those, whatever it's doesn't follow from the whole. That's not a Valda. That's not a correct syllogism. So no, religion doesn't have to be a myth because of Exodus is a myth. So it doesn't. That first doesn't follow. So people mistakenly, modern fundamentalists, imagine that that the Bible's a history book, and they read it as if it were a history book, and then some modern fundamentalists find out, oh, the Bible's not a history book, and then in a lot of cases they leave religion and they become maybe an agnostic or an atheist who continues to be a fundamentalist. They keep thinking that Scripture has to be history in order for it to be true or something like that. But in fact, there's simply a fundamentalist who's no longer part of a traditional religion. Their new personal religion is still influenced by that fundamentalism that they haven't deconstructed. So no, what I would say is religion is something else. Religion is actually an undefinable word. We have a whole lecture on what is religion. Religion as a word is a construct, and we in the West base the idea on religion on our modern experience in the West of Judeo-Christianity and Islam, but actually religion is much more all-encompassing than that. And it might be said that everything that people do beyond strict necessity might be considered religion. And watching TV could be your religion. Watching football, we're about to have a Super Bowl, that's a religion for a lot of people. But it depends, I'm saying that a little flippantly, but the point of it is that it's too complicated to, what is religion? Yes, Exodus is a myth, though. Wolf Pagels asks, could you clarify how you make the connection between James, the brother of Jesus, and the Ebionites? Because if you go and look up Ebionites, it's said to be founded in the 2nd century AD. So we don't know when the Ebionites are founded. We don't have any reference to them under that name until, like you say, later, the 2nd century or so. And so the way I'm making that connection, not just me, but other scholars, this is a hypothetical connection. So this is why I do not present this as has to be the case. But essentially, we know of James, the brother of Jesus, is the leader of a proto-Christian church in Jerusalem. And we know that because Paul, who is a historic figure, talks about James, the brother of Jesus, and talks of him as being a leader of a pillar of the church and being in Jerusalem. And we also have a story from the non-Christian, the Jewish historian Josephus, who talks again about James and talks about him being the leader of a group in Jerusalem and how he was then martyred or killed. And so we know there's a historical James, and the idea of it is that he is the leader of the group after Jesus' death. We have the Ebionites later, and then we have this idea that the word Ebionite possibly comes from the Hebrew word here for the poor, and that perhaps when Paul is talking about the poor and the poor of Jerusalem, and that when the Jamesian church's documents are talking about the poor, and we're emphasizing, like Jesus is saying, blessed are the poor, that maybe this word poor that is found in Ebionite, maybe that is the name of the movement that is predating the word Christian, which did not exist for the movement anyway during Jesus' lifetime. And so that's how we make that connection, but it is a hypothetical connection. Petra Khan says the Judaic faith rejects Christianity. Why? Well, so I'm not Jewish, so I mean, you could ask Jewish people why they do. I mean, the reality is that of the people who were Jewish in the 1st century, a majority did not become Christian. A majority did not find the message of the Jewish Christians, the people who were Jewish who were going around and proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah, and are explaining how they understand it and their understanding of it. That was not a compelling narrative for, let's say, the majority of their co-religionists, and so that's why they rejected that. They rejected the teachings, the sayings, the practices, the goals of their fellow Jews who were in a sect that ultimately becomes Christianity. There was other sects as well, and most of those have all died out. So the only surviving sects, so there's the Israelite religion, the Samaritans, that is actually split before we get to Judaism. Second Temple Judaism. The Samaritans are a surviving sect or religion. There's one tiny branch of Second Temple Judaism that is still Jewish that is not part of the rabbinic movement, but essentially all of Judaism that survives is all descended from rabbinic Judaism, which is kind of reorganized and really gets going after the foundation of Christianity. And so there were other sects as well that are rejected, and they have died out. Patrick Kish asks, I would like to know if John draws any inspiration from Reverend Timothy Lovejoy from The Simpsons. Reverend Lovejoy is, there's a bunch of different things where you can empathize with him. I certainly feel for Reverend Lovejoy when Ned Flanders is constantly coming and wanting to be so helpful, but he's actually too annoying, and he's way too way too pedantic and has all those kind of problems. And so as a pastor, I know what that's like. So not criticizing anybody, but anyway, that's just I definitely feel that way. I also love when Reverend Lovejoy has to ask things like why do you hate my trains to God, and all the other problems that poor Reverend Lovejoy has. In general, though, he's actually really burned out, and he is not enthusiastic, and so he's pretty much going through the motions, and he's saying, and flim flam begat so and so, and Habakkuk, and all this kind of, we'll now read from the Lamentations of Jedediah, long version or extended version, just so he doesn't have it, so he isn't doing it with joy. And actually, I'm extremely inspired, and I'm constantly invigorated by both my congregation here locally and also this global community that we're a part of. And so, in that sense, Reverend Lovejoy is a negative inspiration for me. I'm not jaded like him. Song Smithy 7 asks, why can't James be Jesus' younger maternal brother, and Jude be James' paternal full brother? Okay, well, I'm just going to tell you guys, it's very lucky for all these James the brother of Jesus questions. We are going to have a lecture on James the brother of Jesus on March 19th. So I know that you guys are excited about this. So this is coming from, we were talking in one of these lectures recently about the book of Jude, which is one of the shortest books in the New Testament. It's a one-chapter epistle that is reflecting the Jamesian church's perspective, and it claims to be written by a guy named Jude, the brother of James. And traditionally, it's understood to be written by Jude, the brother of James, but that James which is the brother of Jesus. And so the question that a lot of people have asked throughout history is, why wouldn't, if you were Jude, the brother of James, who is the brother of Jesus, why wouldn't you just say, I'm Jude, the brother of Jesus? Aren't you going to get a lot more mileage out of saying you're Jesus's brother? And so Songsmithy here has made a possibility of, let's say, there maybe James is Jude's brother and James is Jesus' brother, but Jude isn't James's brother. So, so if you're saying here that if James is Jesus' maternal brother, and so what you're suggesting is younger brother, you're suggesting then that after Mary had Jesus and then James, which is totally possible in terms of the historical Jesus. It's against Christian tradition. So, right, Christian tradition is that that Mary, well, anyway, there's a tradition of perpetual virginity, but that wouldn't apply to the historical Jesus anyway. That's a tradition, right? So that's fine. But the implication of your question after that is, okay, that after Jesus and James' birth, Joseph dies. I'm sorry, it's half-brother. So after Jesus' birth, Joseph dies, and Mary has a new husband, and then she and her new husband have James as Jesus' younger brother. So they have the same the same mother, but the different fathers. And then you're saying that Jude is James's full brother, which would mean then, again, he's the son of Mary and her new husband. And so if that's the case, then it doesn't solve anything, because then Jude would still be the half-brother of Jesus, and so why wouldn't he mention that? So for your solution to work, they can't be full brothers. The idea that Mary's new husband, James's father, would have had to have a son by a different wife, and then Jude would be the half-brother of James, and Jesus would be the half-brother of James, but Jude and Jesus would only be related by adoption. And so that's clever, but it doesn't get us anywhere. I'm just going to say. So we don't, this is all, at a certain point, when you're doing any of those things, it's just idle speculation. And so, yes, there's a possibility where this could literally be true if you go through this whole rigmarole. And this is the reason why we should not be so intent on saving literalism and literal readings. My suggestion to why this would be the case, why would Jude say he's James's brother and not mention that he's Jesus's brother, is that in the Jamesian church, James is an important authority. It's not just all about Jesus. And Jude is maybe indicating that he is the successor of James, and so he's mentioning James, who was a leader of this movement for decades, or a long time anyway, whereas Jesus would have been a leader for a couple years, and so that's potentially why. In other words, that they have a very different understanding of the roles of Jesus and James. But that's also speculation. But that would be how my reading of it. Rye the King asks, do you ever use Dan McClellan's scholarship as a Mormon himself? He's LDS, but a critical scholar, prolific in his online presence. Is there any chance for a collaboration? So I don't know. So I mean, mostly within LDS circles, I have to say I'm just not familiar, and I apologize to Dan. I am mostly aware of and a part of the historians community. So maybe if he's a historian and a newer one, and I just don't know him, I apologize. But a lot of times this is if Mormons are doing theology and things like that, I'm way less aware of what they're doing. So I don't know. I am going to be out in Utah this summer for the Sunstone symposium, anyway, and so it's possible I'll look him up and see. I want to also now go back and do some more thank yous to supporters. And between, we're going to run through some of these in between different questions, because the fact that you guys are supporting us is allowing us to do this. So Ariel Tejera Molina from Mexico City, thank you. Barbara Lang from Huntington Station, New York. Robert Lipscomb from St. Paul, Minnesota. Timothy Cooley from New York, New York. James Bishop from, Opelika, Alabama. Craig Stodd from Friday Harbor, Washington. Don Frieda from Glassboro, New Jersey. Ralph Lebkucher from St. Petersburg, Florida. Nancy Barnett from Eustis, Florida. Justin Kirkland from Dothan, Alabama. Thank you guys for all of your support. Sphinx 4 asks, what do you think of Dr. Elaine Pagels' interpretation of the Book of Romans, where the contrast between Jews and Gentiles was viewed by early Gnostics as being symbolic of a psychic called, those are called, and a pneumatic elect divide? So I have to tell you, Sphinx 4, I have not heard Elaine's presentation on that. I find that very interesting. I find I always like to listen to what Elaine Pagels has to say about Gnosticism, and really, I had always tended to, especially let's say even Thomas and the Gnostics as maybe being, a little later redaction, and she helps convince me that maybe this is happening earlier in. And it's always interesting, so I want to read more about that. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. Minor Threat asks, did Charlemagne want the Pope to put the crown on him? It seems like it overshadowed him becoming king. Did he see them as trying to take his power? So Minor Threat, I think you might be thinking of two separate Pope King of the Franks incidents. So there's two different interactions that are really important that popes had with the Carolingian family. So Charlemagne's father, Pepin, had not been the king. So Pepin had been, just like his father, Charles Martel. So Charles Martel was this important leader who won the Battle of Poitiers against Muslim raiders from Andalusia, from Spain. And But he did that without being king. So the kings at that point, the royal family of the Franks, the Merovingian line, had become essentially puppets who had no power, and their major domos, as they were called, which just means we have the word major domo from this. It means mayor of the palace, major domo. That those guys had become the rulers de facto. And so, at a certain point, Charles Martel's son, Pepin, Charlemagne's father, writes to the Pope and asks, doesn't it make sense that he who has the power should also wear the crown? And the Pope, knowing that he needs actually a new ally, the Franks as a new ally, because he is beset by these Lombards all around him, and the emperor in the east is no longer able to help. The East Romans, the Byzantines, are no longer able to bring any support militarily to Rome, and so the Pope has become de facto independent, in charge of his own little county around Rome. He is making a new alliance with this Frankish lord, and he tells Pepin, absolutely, yes, you should be king. And so that is a precedent for creating a new papal power. And so if we're talking about that overshadowing him becoming king, it was his dad, Pepin, who becomes the king at the Pope's legitimization. So the Pope gets something out of that by saying, I get to depose the king of the Franks, a guy who has no power, and instead declare that a new guy, Pepin, the Carolingian, is going to be the king. So then later, his son, Charlemagne, who is now even so much more powerful than his own father had ever been, comes to Rome and is crowned emperor. We do not know, because we don't have the sources to indicate that how this was planned or not. It definitely seems, though, I would think that actually this is something that was agreed upon. It was not a surprise where the Pope just popped and did it, and Charlemagne had no idea it was going to happen or anything like that. He was very pleased with this happening. It didn't overshadow him being king. He was already king. It was allowing him to assert a new kind of royal power, a royal power that is over, like the emperor is beyond a king, So he's now the secular head of Christendom. In the West, and actually because they are also sort of simultaneously saying that they aren't recognizing the authority of Constantinople, they later kind of do, and then now there's two emperors again, just like earlier when the East and West had been split. In any event, I think it is something that he actually wanted and probably conspired with the Pope, that they decided, the Pope maybe had the idea, but they decided to do it. Maybe together, although we can't know for sure. Bob Garrison says, what is the best book about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and did Brigham Young order it or not? So the Mountain Meadows Massacre is an event in the history of Utah where a party of pioneers, settlers who are coming on the overland trails from Missouri and are going to go trying to colonize California, they have to go through Utah. And a group of Mormons attack the train and besiege it. They pretend that they're Native Americans, and they might have had a couple Native American scouts and things like that, but it's the Mormons that are doing it. And then ultimately, they kill everybody. They massacre everybody. So it's a horrible massacre, and there's been scapegoating of Indians and everything else. The best book on this is called Blood of the Prophets by Will Bagley, who's a friend of mine who's now passed away, great historian of the West. Blood of the Prophets. Did Brigham Young order it or not? We don't have the evidence of whether Brigham Young ordered it or not. Brigham Young probably didn't order it. He probably, in my view, but he authorized them to attack and rob from the train and set up the conditions that led to the massacre. And then, absolutely, we can say that Brigham Young was a unindicted felon after the fact, because he committed the felony of obstruction of justice to prevent the people who absolutely were guilty, for sure, of doing the acts, whether he ordered it or not, from ever coming to justice, with the exception of the one scapegoat that they gave to the federal government, John D. Lee. Landgreaves 6419 asks, why don't the Gospels reflect more of Pauline Christianity? I understand that the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels is different from the teaching of Paul, and so might this difference have been even more pronounced had the Gospels been written in the 50s? By the time the Gospels were written, it seems that Pauline Christianity was very strong. Therefore, it seems the Gospels would reflect more of Paul's understanding of Jesus. So it is an interesting, that's a very interesting question. That's a very astute question. So we're going to have a whole lecture next week on why Paul's church won. Why did Paul win in terms of the overall thing? It is still very open. It is still a very open question, all through the whole first century as the Gospels are being written. So even the Gospel of Luke, which is written by somebody who is probably a Greek convert to Christianity, so somebody who's from a Paul-like community, and maybe even one of the communities that Paul founded, although that later, it was now Paul's been dead for a while and it has undergone transformation and so on. And so even though Luke, which is maybe the most Greek Christian of the Gospels, Luke and Acts are two halves of the same book, so that's the same author. Even though Luke is from kind of a Greek, maybe we even think of a Pauline kind of church, Luke doesn't even, and also Paul becomes a hero of the second half of Acts, so it's not like Luke is anti-Paul, but even Luke isn't, one of the things Paul was even fighting for was trying to get the original Christians, who had been the apostles under Jesus, to recognize him as being an apostle, and a lot of them maybe weren't doing that. And so he had to argue that he didn't need a little ID card to show that he was an apostle, that Christ had called him through a vision, through personal revelation, to be an apostle. And I think that Luke doesn't actually give Paul that title in Acts. And so Luke does not agree with a lot of things that Paul has. So there is still a diversity of perspectives. And so Paul's winning is something that took longer. And so we have a lot of other competing communities. So the Matthewan community and the Johannine community, the John community, they're their own kind of separate things. The Matthewan community does seem to be a group that is still adhering to Jewish law adherence. And so that's still going strong in the first century, and that in that book. And same thing, the John Church, the Johannine Church is they're talking about making a big deal, for example, about Samaritans, so that it's a mixed group. There's Gentiles and Jews and Samaritans that have come together, and they have their own separate tradition too, that is possibly, again, not lionizing Paul and Paul's ideas, although anyway, it's all kind of in flux. And so I think, if they'd been written even earlier, then it would maybe even be very different. So if we had a gospel that was written in the 50s, we'd have a different, potentially rawer, if it's not from Paul's group, a potentially less what we now think of as Christian gospel, but you can see that there's a lot of these ideas were in flux and they're still tracking pretty slowly, because there's a lot of differences from Paul's writings, even in these later Gospels, later than Paul, the early Gospels still. Jeff Kuntz asks, are you familiar with Reconstructionist Judaism? Their positions on religion here and now, including literalism, align so closely with your vision for Community of Christ. I am not familiar with that, but it sounds wonderful. We definitely have had wonderful connections with different Reform Jewish synagogues here in Toronto. So one of our programs is called Encounter World Religions, and multiple times gone and had Shabbat Sabbath with Holy Blossom Temple, which is the Central Reformed synagogue and really important within Reformed Judaism. But I need to look up Reconstructionist Judaism. Certainly here and now is what we're trying to do, like you say, in Community of Christ. And yeah, I tend to get along. We sometimes, I do a lot of ecumenical work, which means work with other Christians. But sometimes I enjoy interfaith work more because we find more commonalities with other progressive religions than I do with people who, yes, they're Christian, but they're in such a different place in terms of literalism and fundamentalism and things like that, that I find them to be much more alien tradition. Michael Rogers, thank you for your support. Michael asks, the problem of evil is a tough one for all those who have seen and been through a lot. Yes, I agree. Does the belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God make this notion impossible? I wish the lecture on this topic went into more depth. I should probably do another lecture on the problem of evil, because you cannot escape the problem of evil. So I would say that the problem of evil is the number one most important argument against the idea of a all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. Because I think that every time people come up with, let's say, little things, whether we call them theodicies, but essentially little answers of explaining, away evil. Like a common theodicy is, well, life is just a test, and and so this is just something that we're gonna, it'll all be sorted out in the afterlife, and so on. That is in my view, a very flippant answer to suffering. It tests. We can say very clearly in terms of the problem of evil, in my view. I think it's incontrovertible that sometimes people will say, well, you won't ever be tested past your capacity. That's not true. People face horrible suffering that is beyond anybody's capacity. That's not the evil that exists and suffering that exists is so gratuitous in some senses that it calls a lot of this into question. It doesn't. So I'm going to tell you, in my view, it doesn't make the notion impossible. And I've just give a caution about giving a theodicy. So now, if I'm going to give you a theodicy, I want to I not be indicted by my own theodicy as making it too flippant. But what my idea is, or how I understand this theologically, is that the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God does not make capricious interventions for good or ill. And so you think, well, I survived this hurricane, and I'm praying and thanking God that I survived the hurricane. There was no capricious intervention that made you survive the hurricane any more than there was a capricious intervention that made your neighbor killed in that. So there is not these kinds of those kinds of interventions, if, in my view, theologically, because if there were, then that would indict the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God for being evil and the cause of evil. And so that would be my answer, and obviously we have to go into a lot more depth to get to that, but we should do another topic on that, another lecture on that, because it's nothing that we shouldn't treat lightly or quickly and have to think about a lot. Chris McCarthy, thank you for your support, asks, or actually mentions as a possible future topic, misquotation of the Old Testament by the New Testament, and has this caused anti-Jewish sentiment? Can acknowledgement of it help Christian and Jewish ecumenism? So there is a bunch of, for sure that there is a bunch of, unfortunately, text in the New Testament that includes anti-Jewish sentiment and has been a source of anti-Semitism in Christianity in history. So there's some awful stuff in even Matthew, which is the most Jewish Christian gospel. There's some statements in there that are really horrible, and same thing. There's a bunch of in the Gospel of John, where because again the Gospel of John is coming from a community that is already separated from, has already been kicked out of the synagogues, and so they are now calling their rivals the Jews, even though they had within a generation ago been a Jewish sect themselves. And so that definitely exists. There are texts that are causing anti-Jewish sentiment, and we have to explain that the context of the evangelists is their own context. So I just mentioned that the authors of John are already writing in a time period after the religions have split apart. So we have to acknowledge that bias that they have and apologize for that, and apologize to our Jewish sisters and brothers for how that has informed lots of terrible things in Christian history. In terms of the misquotation, I think that what we mostly have is a misunderstanding of what the quotation is doing. So New Testament writers are reading the Old Testament typologically as a typology where we're more or less saying that New Testament stories, the meaning of them is symbolic of the Christian gospel, and that is a way to read something with meaning. It is, but it is not. But Christians have understood that incorrectly as being historical. So in other words, Isaiah, the original Isaiah, is not, having a crystal ball and looking into the future and seeing Jesus or something like that. And that's how some Christians will have understood prophecy. That's not how prophecy works. And that's actually not how the New Testament is making use of a typological, a meaningful reimagining the meaning of what Isaiah is doing. But because of, I appreciate why you're calling that misquotation. There is certainly a meta misinterpretation going on that most Christians have. I would say majority of Christians had. And if we acknowledge that, if I can actually even explain it and acknowledge it properly, I think that would help Jewish and Christian ecumenism. I think that when I talk to Jewish friends and Jewish leaders, I think that they understand that pretty easily after we talk about it for a while, and I acknowledge the misuse of that in our tradition too. So then we can get along very much better, like you say. Delphin Iden asks, on the Myers-Briggs personality tests, I bet Mr. Hamer tests INTJ, doesn't he? I recognize that urge to give all the information. Well, Delphin Iden, I have taken, that Myers-Briggs personality test more than once in my life. So I do actually, you are quite correct. I normally get the result of INTJ or ENTJ. So usually I'm always on the cusp between the I and the N. So I and N, that's introversion versus extroversion. And then the other ones, NTJ is intuitive thinking and judging. And so that's generally speaking how I test, yes. So you're right. Going to thank some more people. Thank you for contributing to Center Place in the last year. David Hohenstein from Bay City, Michigan. Joel Hallberg from Beloit, Wisconsin. Elsie Wood from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Diana Patterson. Jeremy Bramble. Sean Matheson from St. George, Utah. Michael Cantrall from Pilot Hill, California. Richard Brown from Olney, Maryland. Sven Pohl. Edie Romano from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Michael Rogers says, Does John have plans to publish a book one day? I would love to hear him on the Michael Shermer podcast, Dan McKellen, or another intellectual. I'm very happy to go on other podcasts. So I've been on just a handful of, I've been on a bunch of Mormon podcasts, but I've been on just a handful of other, let's say Bible or this kind of history podcasts and things like that, and be very happy to join all of those. In terms of publishing a book, I am absolutely supposed to publish book. I've written some books in terms of Latter-day Saint history and things like that. But I have a few books that projects that I really have to get going on, and so specifically, a major book is. I don't have a title for it here yet. It's essentially like, rational faith, why the West needs to reboot Christianity in the 21st century. Something like that, so that we can explain what the idea, why we need to get past, some of the, the nonsense stuff that the bulk of Christian churches are worried about, and actually have, though, a community that is past all of this stuff historically, and instead is able, with that kind of honesty and integrity, to continue to do things like we have a forum where we can live life meaningfully together. We can obviously continue to have and celebrate and mourn together life issues. The fact that I do baby blessings and marriages and funerals, that's an important thing that we're deconstructing out of our lives by eliminating organized religion in our lives. That we need to be able to have a place where we can get together outside of our tribes and do things like work on social housing. I'm able to be the president of our social housing charity that we have here in the city, or like I say, our Encounter World Religions program, where we're educating people about different religions so that we can break down barriers of misunderstanding. So peacemaking, that kind of thing. So I think we need all of those things, and I did make a resolution this year that I had to write a book this year. So you guys can all hold me to that. I'm supposed to be doing it. Okay. Dark Saurian, thank you so much for your support. Dark Saurian asks, if there was a massive Passover gathering during the time of Pontius Pilate, then does anyone know what everyday pagan Egyptians thought about the Moses story? Did they think it never happened? I don't think that I don't know. So I don't know that they think it never happened. I don't think that that's the case. So so we're living in a time period where we have, invented academic history. There was, we're talking about here the time of Pontius Pilate. So we're talking about the age of Hellenism and now Greco-Roman history. And so there is a tradition that has developed of ancient Greek Hellenistic history, and that has only just barely kind of gotten off the launch pad. There's in Egypt, Manetho, who is a Egyptian, but who is in the kingdom of the Ptolemies, has and is writing in Greek, has been able to access just a lot of records that the Egyptians have, and was able to create kind of a Greek-style history of Egypt. And because he's working from those records, I don't think that he would have. The record's lost, so we don't know what a book would be. But I don't think it would have had that in it. That said, by the time Pontius Pilate's around, by the time we're getting to the first century of the Common Era, there will have already been a significant Jewish community in Egypt for 6 centuries, because already by the time of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, Jeremiah and a lot of the Judean army fled to Egypt, and the Pharaoh at the time, what you do often when you have like that kind of a foreign group, what you do is you relocate them to the other side of your empire. So they took them to the southern part and to guard the southern frontier, and there is a a city down there that even has a Jewish temple. And then also by the time the Ptolemies get there, there is a vast Jewish community in Alexandria, a bigger community than probably anywhere else in the world. So the Egyptians are familiar with this story, and after a couple hundred years and multiple generations, it's probably accepted as something that happened, and because that's just how people understand that, and then they would have their own apologetics about it that they would write in response to that story. So that's the same kind of thing that happens in Rabbinic Judaism. So it's not that they don't say there was no Jesus. It's that they say that which there was, or that Jesus. They say instead, that Jesus was absolutely not the Messiah. That he was actually they make an apologetic thing. The reason why we don't know anything about his dad was that he's the illegitimate son of a centurion or whatever. So that's how people responded apologetically in ancient times to stories that were largely understood as historical, but it's only in modern times that we can actually look not at what people at Pontius Pilate's time thought about it, but look at the records of the Egyptians and everything that's going on with the Egyptians that have survived for the time period in question, when the character of Moses would have been alive if he were a historical figure. Han Thomas says, some science educators have become vocal in opposing biblical literalism when it doesn't match scientific consensus. Then evangelicals became openly anti-science. How do we come back from that? Yeah. Well, so I think that it's really that's really important, and one of the reasons why I've devoted my life to being a pastor and to being a person who is providing a Christian and an alternative to biblical literalism and fundamentalism, evangelicalism, and all that kind of thing, anti-sciencism. So for me, there is a total compatibility between my religion and science, and I'm in keeping with such greats as Augustine, who said, if you as a Christian start reading the Bible in some dumb way, that any pagan who knows a thing about science, they realize how dumb you are because you're saying the world is flat or something like that, then you're really denigrating the religion. You are actually that's not what we should be doing. And so we're in this situation where there are people who are making like this creationist museum where they really are obsessed with this idea that dinosaurs and humans are living together, and you can fit, I don't know, maybe dinosaurs on Noah's Ark, or how can Noah's Ark could be a literal thing. They built a whole model of it to try to pretend that, and nonsense like that. And so this is, how do we recover from it? It's bifurcating, unfortunately. So we're now getting to a place where there's a rise of Christian nationalism, so-called Christian nationalism, which is not even Christian at all anymore. And it's in a lot of cases not even church-based. People who are just considering themselves that as an identity, whether they go to church or not, and they make the word Christian as being part of their identity, and they're just anti-science and anti-everything, and obviously in terms of Christian nationalism, anti-different races and all kinds of problems. So all we can do is provide, from my perspective, what I can do, or what I try to do, is provide alternatives. We don't make these lectures where I'm condemning anybody. Rather, we are always what we're talking about is how exciting it is actually to learn the real information. It makes the Bible so much more interesting if we know these things than if we just if we just tell it like a kid's story and pretend that all kinds of things that aren't the case are the case. So Donnie Lee Gringo in Brazil asks, A few congregations of Community of Christ have members who are vocal proponents of polyamorous relationships being accepted within the church. Do I have any thoughts? Does John have any thoughts about how that might be considered, let alone implemented, considering Community of Christ's historic connection to anti-polygamy? So our history, as you probably people who are watching know, that we have the background in my church and Community of Christ, where we come out of the same tradition as the Latter-day Saint movement. So founded together with the Mormon Church, the LDS Church in Utah, and then in 1844 we split apart. Brigham Young led his folks off to Utah, and specifically he was the pro-polygamy party. And so the church in Utah wanted to have what we call religious polygyny, which is one man having multiple women as wives. And our church, which is now called Community of Christ, was opposed to that. And so for me, the moral reason for that is in fact not numerical, and it is not about adults making consenting choices. The moral consideration of a religious polygyny system is at its root sexism. So what happens in societies that have religious polygyny? Polygyny is polygamy where there's one man and multiple women. What happens inevitably is the marrying age for the man, the patriarch, becomes older and older, and the marrying age for the women become younger and younger, until you have, functionally grandfathers marrying little girls, and there is therefore no possibility of equal partnership in a relationship. You're having this generational thing of a patriarchal leader, and women infantilized to being not having any self-sovereignty. That is the reason why, for example, in Canada, religious polygyny is against the Charter on Human Rights, because of that inherent, not about number, it's about sexism. And so nowadays, we also are in a time where there are relationships where people have multiple committed people in a relationship that has nothing to do with religious polygyny. Right now, because of the church's history, because we literally were organized or founded because we were opposed to within our own community. I mean, I'll just say it to myself. My great-great-great-great-grandparents, they gave their 15-year-old daughter to Joseph Smith to be a plural wife. This is a travesty. It is an abuse of priesthood authority on Joseph Smith's part. It is it's something I would condemn my grandparents over, for something that should not happen, in this kind of a misuse and misbehavior. And so there's a reason why we've been opposed to that. So we have rules that are against numerical relationships, so committed relationships where there are more than two people in them. But they're based out of that history. And so over time, we'll see what happens. We have to continue to discern in this church policies that are where we continue to be upholding human rights, human dignity, and not be sexist. But it turns out that in some cases, modern things like polyamory, that's getting caught in our net when it probably in the future won't be. George asks, is there a lost text that first comes to mind as you wish one would be found? Oh, what is the first thing that comes to mind of a text that we don't have that I really want? So, George, I'm going to say right off that I am never, I have not read all of the ancient books that we have, And so, I have my, I have my Plato Bible, all of the collected dialogues of Plato, and I like to read from it, but I haven't read all of them, and so in other words, in my view, I have like a wealth, and it's hard for me to like beg for more when I'm not even making use of all the ones that I don't have. I had just barely mentioned a second ago and a couple questions ago the lost history. I think it's Manetho, who is the Egyptian writing in the Ptolemaic period, that he compiled all of the Egyptian history. That if we had that source, that would be amazing, what we would know more about Egyptian history. There's also the Emperor Claudius, I think, wrote a history of the Etruscans that is lost, where he took all of the different texts that would have been known, or anything that was still known about the Etruscans, as people were still could speak Etruscan, even down to that time. That's lost. There's a lot of other great books, that are lost. So I've thought of those off my top of my head, but I mean, there would be a bunch of other ones that I'm sure we would want to have. Certainly, okay. Oh, I know one. So here's if there's a hypothesis, the documentary hypothesis of earlier source texts for the Bible. If the Yahweh source, the J source, was found as an independent separate text, that would be amazing. That would confirm so much that we have hypothesis about the Bible. It would teach us so much more about the Bible. Likewise, in the synoptic problem in the New Testament, if we could find the Lost Sayings Gospel Q that as an actual manuscript, that would be amazing. That would confirm all of these hypothesized ideas. In both of those cases, we wouldn't be getting any text that's new, because we already have the text. But in those first two cases that I mentioned, we would have that. Good follow-up question that's coming now from Tana. Tana, thank you for your support. Tana says, if we found Q, what would be the real-life implications of this find in your view? So it would be important, because we do have to constantly say the Q is a hypothetical source because we don't have it. We don't have it. That said, because it's by far the best hypothesis in my view, I mean, we still treat Q pretty soundly, I think, in the scholarship. So in other words, we still are there's still a lot that we can do with it. It would be nice to be able to confirm that and affirm that. It would make, I mean, the implication would be the last century of literary criticism has been really solid, and our hypotheses are sometimes proved correct. And what would happen for sure is it would be one of the earliest sources, right? And so we would definitely really start to drill down on what was the community that produced this. That already has started, so there are a bunch of wonderful books by Kloppenberg and other who have kind of read into Q and say, well, this is not just a window into Jesus, actually, because it's also a compiled text that is produced by a community that made it. And so what does it tell us about that community? But we would do that a lot more if we actually had Q, because it would be, again, the earliest Christian writing we have. I mean, maybe there'd be some earlier things at Paul, but it would be the earliest thing that connects us very much more directly to Jesus' teachings for sure. And we would want to put it in the Bible, in my view. I would, so it would get to be added. Aaron Brown, thank you for your support. Aaron asks, what's one book everyone should read on any topic? It's an interesting question. So my background is as a historian, and so I am actually, I have a lot of different topics that I can talk about. People can ask me, kind of a drill down on everything from Etruscans to ancient Egyptians and all this kind of thing, because I am pretty well read on all of that. But part of the way that I have gotten there is that I have a big gap in all of my reading in terms of like a lot of modern books. So I am not well read in, let's say, all of the great literature of the modern era. including even, I've read some philosophy, but including just a lot of those kind of things. And so those are usually the books that people will point to, a book of, a modern thinker of some kind that has changed your life. And so I don't have necessarily anyone of that. I have a composite of everything. A book that I guess I would, that I'm going to pull out then with that preface, and I have done a lecture on it because I think it's important, is The Consolation of Philosophy from Boethius. So Boethius is a Christian that is living at the end of the fall of the Western Empire so he's living in the Ostrogothic kingdom, and he's awaiting his execution, and he uses all of the amazing learning of all of antiquity in order to focus you on kind of the question of the meaning of life. And so as he's going to be killed by the king of the Ostrogoths, he has to reflect what is important. Riches aren't important. Fame isn't important. All of these sort of bodily pleasures and everything like that, that's fine. You can enjoy it, but that's not what endures. What endures is a desire that you have to achieve, to have things be good, to be better in life. So they're in a decline, right? The empire is falling. Wanting to make things good and to achieve something where we as a community, as humanity, as the world, where we're all moving towards making things better, where there's less of this horrible suffering and everything in life. And so to the extent that becomes your goal and your agenda, as opposed to some egoistic thing of wanting to build an obelisk to yourself or something like that, and carving your name in stone or something like that, that does endure and live on. So in other words, the thing that you desire most lives on because that good is what continues. And so that's the idea of that book, and it's one of the great books in Western civilization, and it's certainly been popular throughout history. Some people, including Alfred the Great and I think Queen Elizabeth I, both of them translated it themselves into English, or at least read it. Alfred translated it anyway. And so anyway, it's been meaningful for a lot of people. Storm 1968, thank you for your support. Here's a question. Is it a realistic expectation for traditional Christian religions to hope for or strive towards another awakening or revival in the contemporary context with so much choice? So it is a complicated question. We're in a very, I think, very uncharted moment in history. So we have never, this information age that we are all existing in has led to just this incredible, there's a proliferation of information and misinformation, and also the multiple bifurcation of information. There was a time period, or all of time in the past, so in the Middle Ages and Antiquity, there's only so many books. You can potentially have read them all, and then you all, everybody who's read everything, everyone in the culture will all have the same touch points and context within to even talk about each other. And when I was a little kid, and there was only 4 TV networks on, and we all watched the same television shows and the same movies, you would have those same contexts that you could play off of. We're a place where, you can go to the classic seasons of The Simpsons and make a Simpsons reference, and maybe people all know it. I still make those Simpsons references now. We can't expect that everybody who's listening to a lecture like this on YouTube would have even seen The Simpsons anymore. So normally I would say, okay, yes, all of the Western civilization comes through this focus of the Christian tradition. All of if you go through all of this great art, all of this great music, and when I'm talking about great, I'm talking about centuries ago, so from like the year 500 to the year 1600, all of this whole time period, everything that has survived, all of this thought has come through that prism. And so you would imagine that a revival going forward is going to have some of that foundation. And so in that sense, I feel like it would be very sensible for us to do that, to have that kind of a revival and that kind of an awakening. And I certainly am trying to do that, trying to model that myself. Nevertheless, I can definitely see how I have this, where I'm have a lot in common with King Canute, who, it's not true, but this is not a history, but the legend of him anyway is that he goes to the sea in order to himself. He's such a great king that he's going to push back the tide, and of course, obviously, even the great king can't push back the tide. And so there is a trend in history. There is a direction that everything's going, and in a lot of cases, I feel I'm definitely pushing against water, which doesn't really work. This kind of a force, a historical force where I am counter trend. It's impossible to know. So when we are in even the best historian can only, I think, make good predictions that are 20, at best 40 years out. And when you're doing that, that what constitutes being good is that you're basing that on the recent past, and things can happen that are unexpected. So it could very well be, we don't know. Mike asks, do I need some water? I have some water. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. This is turning into a marathon. I'm so happy that you guys are asking all these questions. Okay, so we're doing good. There's more questions. So Processa asks, John, I'm a fan of your lectures, especially the medieval history and philosophy. They're incredible. Thank you so much. I'm a queer nerd intellectual, though my field is software development. I would like to know if one must have a Mormon background in order to join Community of Christ. Absolutely not. You do not have to have a Mormon background. I have a Mormon background. Like I say, I have ancestors who joined 7 generations ago, and that's part of my personal and family tradition. There is absolutely no need for that, and it also doesn't have to be important to you, any of those things. We do in this series, I think I'm continually drawing upon a much deeper tradition, right? So when I'm not spending all my time talking about what's happened in the last couple hundred years of my particular denomination's inheritance. I mean, it's important to us. It's important to me that, for example, serving here as pastor, I am the 40th generation, 40th pastor historically, going back to the very first pastor of this congregation in 1836. And so, it's an inheritance that we take seriously, but it is also, I look back to the whole Christian inheritance, and indeed, prior to that, the Abrahamic and Judeo-Christian inheritance, and indeed, the whole pagan inheritance and the inheritance of civilization going all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so none of the more recent or Mormon stuff, you don't need any of that background to be a part of Community of Christ. You can just start. We have a Sunday service called Beyond the Walls on the same channel, and you can just start attending that. And if you're interested, then you'll learn more about the church part of this. Laurent Burton says, I'm going to have a little more water. What more progressive branches of Christianity are out there, especially in Europe? Since wanting your lecture, I wanted to engage more with the religion, especially after leaving Eastern Orthodoxy long ago. So I have to say, I know that in Europe, there's been a general collapse of a lot of organized Christianity, and then in the East and the South, there has been a tradition anyway of being, the national church as being the predominant church, and then a lot of people are mostly secular now. So I don't know, what's a great active church in terms of a very progressive Christianity in Europe. There's a bunch of very progressive churches here in North America. So the biggest church biggest Protestant church in Canada is called the United Church, and they're very progressive and they're nice. And I have friends who are Quakers. They're an amazing progressive branch of Christianity. There's a bunch of other really great churches, but I have to tell you, I'm sorry that you'll just have to look it up in Europe. I don't know offhand. I want to thank more people who contributed to Center Place lectures in the past year. So these include Jesse Rayner from Raleigh, North Carolina, Joanne Scapelit, I'm going to say it right, in Jamestown, New York, Derek Holemans, Jeff Mitchell, Lawrence Simmons in Grandview, Missouri, Michael Query from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, Tim Schultz, Ben Hamer, my brother in Lakeville, Minnesota, thank you, Ben, Aaron Christensen in Chandler, Arizona, Alexander McCarthy in Sunland, California. Carrie Imrie asks, hi John, do you believe God prompts us to move in certain directions? I have experienced tasks that I was drawn to undertake, even though emotionally and intellectually I really didn't want to do that task or respond to that invitation. It was repeatedly brought to my mind that I should undertake them. So I guess I understand God to be a source of inspiration and revelation, and certainly we envision, the Holy Spirit that way as epiphany, when something suddenly makes sense and everything clicks in your brain and that kind of a thing. That's one way that we can understand it. So I talked about this a little bit with the problem of evil, is in terms of the question of what I called capricious intervention. And so my build on that for me is the idea that inspiration and invitation essentially is open to everyone. So in other words, we all are able to, through very meaningful discernment, understand, a responsible sense of calling, and that we can understand to be inspired, and that with the idea, though, that all are called, that everyone is able to do that if to the extent that people want, whether anybody wants to call it that. You can feel inspired and not use the word God, but in other words, that this is something that is open to all. And so I think that you can understand that sense of calling that you've had, Carrie, in a good way, in that same way that you've understood it. And I don't think, again, we shouldn't, my view of terms of response to inspiration is responsible discernment, which is if you just say, oh, I've got a sense of doing this, and you respond to it, and it's just it's very flippant, or you're just acting on what is essentially whimsy, this is probably not a responsible discernment. But it sounds like this is something that you've thought about. It's repeatedly come to your mind, and it's sometimes even challenging to you, which is good, because when we're challenged, that allows us to grow. So that would be my interpretation. Han Thomas says, many separate Christianities came up in a short time. Would this be an argument for Jesus' historicity? We understand the early Jesus movement to be small, and yet there's so many groups. So I don't think it has to be, no. And so to give, in this sense, the mythicists their due, you can have a lot of diversity really fast. And one of the things that is definitely true is, so one of the times people think is that there has to be an evolution, a slow evolution from a low Christology, in other words, experience of a very human Jesus, since they're experiencing the real historical Jesus who was a human, and that would only slowly evolve into a high Christology with a very mythic Jesus. In fact, however, what we find is Paul has a really high Christology out of the gate, so those kind of transitions can happen very fast. Same thing, diversity can happen really fast. So I don't think it has to be that way. I think that we have good, very good evidence for Jesus' historicity, just even in the form of, again, Jesus's immediate followers who are historical figures, his family who are historical figures, and that sort of thing. He is extremely well attested out of anybody who would be a peasant like this in the first century, and certainly, compared to any, like any of these other, like compared to the Buddha, and so on, where we have very little evidence for the historical Buddha and that kind of thing. This is why this is actually not in question. So there is a very popular movement that is, about a non-historicity of Jesus, but it is not. There's the academic consensus is totally against that. And so, unless you are a very well-trained historian who is studying this thing very particularly, if you're just a regular listener or pop listener, this is something that can be put out of your mind. The consensus is there. Jesus is a historical figure. Nadav Kravitz, thank you for your support. Nadav asks, given the gradual evolution of Abrahamic religion from polytheistic monolatry to henotheism to monotheism to Trinity, in the case of Christianity, how can we understand the modern forms to be, in any sense, the same as the original theology or worship? So there is a tradition that goes back to how people in ancient times wanted things to be, that they wanted, they believed in a golden age myth where everything was perfect, that all of the knowledge had been revealed to demigods and heroes and so on in antiquity, and everybody had fallen away and knowledge had decayed and all that kind of thing. But the thing that they could identify was truth was that there is this true foundation. So that's the golden age myth. It's a myth. Instead, what has happened is humans are coming up with ideas, and they are maybe responding, as we were just talking about before, to inspiration, but they still have to understand things within their own limited context and things, ideas, and what they have. They aren't. There's no time machine where God is sending them pictures of aircraft carriers or anachronistic things. They are rather experiencing, the divine in their life, putting it into terms that they understand. Over time, thoughts develop, ideas emerge. We have so much more ideas in terms of just ethics, how things work, everything like that than they had in ancient times. So of course we have a very different evolved and a more advanced understanding of God, but we're still doing this kind of thing, whereas God is in infinity. So there's not even any difference. How is it the same? Our understanding is limited now, and it was more limited then, and hopefully over time we are continually learning and growing, learning from errors and building up. So it's the same in that God is the same, even though the understanding has always been limited, and it was more in error than it is now, which is still in error. That's how I would see it. Philosophy, thank you for your support. Philosophy asks, what is your view of the recent calling of the new prophet and president of the Community of Christ and its significance in the Restoration movement? So in my church, the Community of Christ, the leader of the church, that's the president of the church, and that person also is called to be the prophet of the church. And the meaning of that is, as a calling, the prophet discerns, they compose what we call inspired counsel in response to thoughtful discernment and inspiration, revelation from God. That text, inspired counsel, they choose to present that to the church. The church meeting in a world conference, which is our denomination's equivalent to the ancient councils like the Nicene Council of Nicaea, where delegates of representing all of the areas of the church worldwide meet together every 3 years. The prophet brings that document of inspired counsel, and if we all agree through our own process of introspection and revelation that this is text that God is wanting to give us to be part of our scriptures, then we all vote together and then we put that in the scriptures, and that becomes a new part of our book of Doctrine and Covenants. And so that's what a prophet and president are. The person also serves as the president of the church. As philosophy is pointing out, we've just revealed that the person who's going to be called to the next to serve as the next prophet is Stacy Cram. And so Stacy has been one of the 12 apostles of our church. She has been the presiding bishop of our church, which is the person who's in charge of temporal affairs and finances. And she has been part of the first presidency. The first presidency is the president and the president's two counselors. And so she is actually the most senior, and in my view, the most qualified person in our whole church to serve as the next president of the church. And so when she is ordained, when we go to the World Conference and the church, I predict that the church accepts her and she is ordained to then be the next prophet, the significance will be, yes, so that'll be the first time in Community of Christ, and indeed within the largest churches of the Restoration. Certainly the LDS Church doesn't even have women in priesthood. There have been very tiny LDS churches who have had women leaders, but this will be the first time that one of the two main churches have had a woman who served in that role of prophet. And that will be wonderful historically. But what I will also say about it is that this has not come about in order to have a woman be the prophet, because Stacy's the most qualified person to be it. So what we'll say is that Stacy will be the prophet, and it'll happen that she's the first woman prophet, but it's not, she's not going to be prophet because she's a woman. It's that it'll be bringing something very, the fact that part of a person's identity will be brought to the church, and that will be also very wonderful. She will be able to, she'll be able to bring her experience to fulfill that calling in a new way. Philosophy also asks, what is Community of Christ's view of the LDS Church's claim on apostolic succession being to Brigham Young and not others, and what do you believe about the claims of the various sects of Mormonism? So in 1844, the original founding prophet of our church, Joseph Smith, also the founding prophet of the Mormon Church, we were the same church until he died, didn't leave a clear successor. So he had appointed his son on multiple occasions. He said that his son will be the prophet of the church, but his son was like 13 years old when he died, and so nobody assumed that would happen overnight. And so instead, there were different proposals were put forward. In terms of the LDS claim on apostolic succession, over time, the apostles claimed that they held various priesthood keys. I think that doesn't hold up. So that isn't, it's not scriptural, it's not canonical. When they're describing, holding the various priesthood keys, they're actually referring to a ceremony that they'd had in a council of 50, of which the 12 were all members of that council. And it had nothing to do with the 12, and indeed it had nothing to do with the church. It was about something else that Joseph Smith was establishing called the kingdom of God on earth. And so the church existed without those keys. According to the document that Brigham Young had his own possession, that only one man on earth could ever hold those keys anyway. And it's not possible, therefore, for the 12 to have had the keys and come together in Young. So I think that the claim, I don't think the LDS Church's claim is very good. Their claim is not based on anything, in my opinion, religious or historical. It's de facto, the fact that the huge body of members are all part of that church. And so because Brigham Young was able to convince like a whole large group of the people, certainly the vast majority of the people at the headquarters, to go move with him to Utah, he created a de facto succession. In terms of the various other sects, in terms of their claims, My favorite other group that I hang out with a lot are the Strangites. They have a great claim. We had a whole lecture on James Strang, and so their claim has a great claim in terms of that. They also, though, have not had a prophet since Strang's his martyrdom. He was also killed, just like Joseph Smith. And there's a bunch of other sects. So the polygamous sects, the Brighamites' successors. I already said that I don't think Brigham Young has a good claim, but Brigham Young and his successor, John Taylor, said that if they ever give up polygamy, it won't be the church anymore. And so the fundamentalists have followed that. So anyway, I don't need to keep going into this. This isn't really important because, in my opinion, it doesn't matter. None of that matters anyway. My church and my faith and anything like that isn't based on anything that Joseph Smith did. Ultimately, we're living for now. It's not based on a historical claim. We don't make any historical claims ultimately as our faith. We're actually about again living life meaningfully in the present. So, Jared. If you could have one question about Christianity magically answered, what would it be? I don't really like magic. I don't need magic. What if it answered? I don't know. Because I would like to have. I would like to have all kinds of more documents from the first century, so that we could trace it all out more. So that would be about Christian origins. This is similar to the question about like the lost book that I want found and don't have. That we have so many wonderful books that I haven't been able to read from ancient times that I don't need another one of these lost books. And same thing in terms of most of the answers about Christianity are important. Most of the questions that are important, I think, are not the answerable questions. That's why I also am interested in, philosophy and theology. So part of the, I'm busily reading this wonderful long series, A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. So it's just talking about, it's like this long if you're going to put all the books together, and it more or less shows that philosophy is not about magically answering any question. It's about wrestling with questions, and I kind of feel like that's also a core component of what it is to live a meaningful life. Not to have a magic answer that tells us something, but rather continuously struggling with the important questions. So I'm sorry that I don't have a good answer to that one. It's the same kind of I feel about the Lost Book. Lisa Kopfchen says, what is the connection between Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and the Sermon on the Mount? There seem to be some parallels. So I guess I haven't thought about that before, and so I'm trying to think of what parallels there are offhand. I've read Oedipus Rex, and of course I've read the Sermon on the Mount. Sophocles, I'm trying to think of what Oedipus Rex does that has anything to do with the Sermon on the Mount. I'm sorry, Lisa, if you're one of the people that is actively writing, I'm going to have to ask you to write a follow-up, and I'll come back to you, okay? Joseph, just tell me some more things about a parallel, and then I'll riff off of those. Joseph Eridu says, why is Canaanite mythology so complex and disorganized compared to Greek mythology? I think I'm going to actually dispute your question. I think Greek mythology can maybe seem to be organized because so many we have so much of it, and so many scholars have gone through and made books that try to make it all organized. In point of fact, actually, because there's all kinds of different sources, and it was understood very differently in each little town. There wasn't like one, pope of ancient Greek paganism. That was making sure that everybody was on the same page. There's all kinds of different answers to who is even the parent of any one god, or what's the origin story of any one god, and it's actually the number of gods in the pantheon it extends like amazingly, and it's down to so there's just a vast mythology that's very disorganized and very complex if we really start digging into the Greek mythology. Canaanite mythology, by contrast, because we have so few sources, I don't know that it's not as complex and disorganized. What we have is we have such a less full record that it seems like there's all these gaps, and so it's hard to understand it. We have with Greek mythology so much. We have a more of an abundance of wealth that people who like to do organizations of it can just take the dominant tradition, delete the rest, and make a chart, and somehow it seems organized. So I think that would be my perception of the two in terms of complexity and organization. Jeffroli Evertinitz asks, did early Jews and Christians banish mentally challenged people or hold them in high regard? So I think in almost every case, when you're having someone who's mentally challenged, what we would understand now, it's going to depend on the individual circumstance, because there will be, different people have different mental challenges or different, if we're talking about what we now understand to be autism and a spectrum or other kinds of, let's say, very serious mental illness or developmental issues. It would be possible to, for some communities to see people as maybe, like an oracular, in other words, somebody who's attuned to God, but it could also see a person as being, possessed by demons, depending, or a person who is otherwise, cursed by God in some way, I think is completely a possible take. And so I think that there was in general in antiquity, we're talking about like ancient times, early Jews and Christians. I think there in general was people who now are able to live long lives and into adulthood because of how we have medicine, and we also have more wealth and more compassion, and we can devote resources to it. People are able to live into adulthood and long lives. I have an aunt who who's both blind and has mental developmental challenges, and she's able to live a very full life now in a group home because she has a staff and so on that are able to help her. I think what happened in antiquity, not only among Jews and Christians, but pagans and everyone, is that a person wouldn't usually have been able to live into adulthood. There was a high infant mortality, and there was even also infantilism, so death by exposure. There is also something that happened. So Sphinx 4 asks, were there any ancient religions in the region at the time that did not have secret teachings reserved for initiates? Essenes did, Romans with their mystery schools did, and Jesus is speaking in parables. Yeah, so it depends on the interpretations of early Christianity. So yes, there are definitely some sects like the Essenes and the Gnostics and the mystery religions had secret teachings and things that are reserved for initiates. So, Jesus speaking in parables, there is an interpretation of why Jesus speaks in parables in the Gospel of Mark. So Mark is the earliest of the narrative Gospels, and Mark's understanding of parables is that Jesus is doing that in order to hide or to mask teachings from the uninitiated. But when I think Luke and Matthew, even the authors of those Gospels, read that, they don't necessarily even agree with Mark, and they kind of change and correct Mark's apologetic there. I certainly don't agree that that's what parables are for. So I think parables are not about trying to, I agree that the evangelist, that Mark thinks that's what they're for, and he quotes Jesus, he pretends that that's what Jesus is saying. I think he makes that up. That's not what Jesus is doing, in my view. In my view, a parable, a good parable, is not about just an analogy where there is some kind of a secret teaching or an answer or something like that, but rather it's a thing that is getting us to think. It's something that's challenging our everyday common wisdom, and is causing us to go get into dialogue, frankly, with Jesus. And so in that sense, I don't think that is a. I don't actually agree that those are for a secret teaching for the initiated. There were things that that maybe you wouldn't be allowed to do as a Christian if you hadn't already gone through baptism. So often when you have a boundary maintenance in a group, just like you're saying, there's things that are part of the group that you can do, and if you're not part of the group, you can't do. But some of them are really focused on that, when that's, for example, a very strong mystery school. And then there's also, like with the Essenes, where you have a closed community that is actually like sharing property and things like that. So then you have to, when you're getting to the point where you have like a monastic order where you're all sharing property together, you have to be really committed to be a part of that, so that people don't just walk in and take all the stuff and so on. So, okay, Beast asks, can you make a detailed video on Paul, as he's the only one of the contemporaries of Jesus himself, who we have text from the early time, who met contemporaries of Jesus himself? Yes. So the next week, Beast, we are going to have a lecture on why Paul's churches won, and that's going to include a lot of stuff on Paul. We may do another whole lecture. Paul's worth more than one lecture, and we may do more lectures on Paul, but I'm certainly going to hit this a little bit just even next week. I'm going to do a pretty deep dive into Paul, and I agree. It's well overdue. We need to do that. So let's thank some more people who contributed this last year. I really appreciate all of the support all of you keep giving. John Roberts, thank you, from Kenmore, Washington. Peter Fell from New York, New York. James Monroe from Norfolk, Virginia. Charles Reynolds from Suffern, New York. Reagan Harrington from San Francisco, California. Clarissa Reeve from Orem, Utah. Galen DaCosta from here in Toronto. Gretchen Lewatsky from Long Beach, California. Daryl Scott from Wisconsin. And the Ken Rector Foundation from here in Toronto, Canada. Thanks to all of you. Voice in His Head asks, any chance you'll cover the Fourth Crusade without overemphasizing Latin apologists and their modern day defenders, maybe? We could, because it's critical. I think the Fourth Crusade, obviously this is the real backstab and death blow to the East Roman Empire, which has an after recovery with the Kingdom of Nicaea that eventually kind of takes back over. But I think I wouldn't emphasize the Latin apologists too much. I don't think that they, I don't think it's very defensible. Certainly not from a crusade standpoint, anything that happened. I think that when we were talking about this is essentially a crusade that gets hijacked by the Venetians, and they again take over, they sack Constantinople instead of doing anything crusade worthy. So it's important to talk about, because it is important for that history of the Roman Empire, and also of that history for the division between Eastern and Western Christianity. That's some very that's a source of important bad blood between Eastern and Western Christianity, where the West very badly behaved, right? Did a horrible thing. Aaron Rivera asks, does anyone know what software Mr. Hamer uses to make all of his charts and graphs? I use Adobe Illustrator, so I use the whole Adobe suite of products, and I've been using that since I was in high school on the high school newspaper in 1988. And so the drawing program that I use to make charts and that kind of thing, charts and graphs, is Illustrator. I also use Photoshop, and I use Premiere for video and that kind of thing. Kaiwan F8 says, to what degree do you differ from Bart Ehrman, e.g. the apocalyptic prophet description? So I agree with Bart Ehrman a lot that the early proto-Christian movement and then the early Christian movement has a very serious apocalyptic strain, including apocalypticism, literalist apocalypticism. And by the way, I mean, we have, like a huge number of our important writers. So Paul is a literal apocalypticist. The author of Mark is a very serious apocalypticist. From what we can tell from Jesus' predecessor, John the Baptist, we have less. We don't know for sure. We're getting some of the things of what he might be saying out of Q. It does seem like he isn't, talking about maybe that the end is nigh. So in other words, an apocalypticist. So certainly, Jesus' predecessors and his successors. That said, we also have contemporary strains, of Christians who are apocalypticists but not literalists, who are talking instead about a realized kingdom of heaven, a spiritual kingdom that is existing on earth now, or that is coming into being, that isn't going to require a physical destruction of the world. And so in that kind of camp, there are some of the sayings, again, of Jesus. We also have the significant author of the Gospel of John, John 2, who seems to be talking about a more symbolic or meaningful millennium or end of the world kind of thing, as opposed to a literal one. And so the degree to which, one thing about Bart Ehrman, what he's saying is absolutely academically defensible. I don't have any dispute that may well be the case. It may well be the case, yes. My reading of it is I think that's part of the movement, and that potentially the historical Jesus is more on the camp of, well, what John the Baptist was saying didn't come to happen. Maybe we can be talking about a kingdom that exists when we are all behaving this way now, and then other people who wanted to continue to say, no, really, this is literal, and the end of the world's about to happen. We're also continuing to be part of that movement and important in that movement. And so that's where we differ, which is a nuanced difference, I would say. Han Thomas asks, is Jesus' mythicism on the rise in serious academic circles? Atheist scholar Bart Ehrman is now also opposed by atheists, claiming that you can't be an atheist while considering Jesus to be a historical figure. No, it is not on the rise in academic circles, serious academic circles. It's a view that is popularized, and the reason why I actually think it's a problem is that I think that it means, and I appreciate that atheists like this idea and why it would be popular, but I think that this is the same thing that is part of I'm just going to describe this as part of a post-Mormon narrative. When ex-Mormons leave the Mormon church, they say, oh, now they find out that a lot of Mormon truth claims. The Book of Mormon is not an ancient document, it's a modern document. There's all these things that are not what the church teaches, are not true. But then they often believe this idea that this guy named Solomon Spaulding wrote the Book of Mormon. No serious academics believe that. That's wrong. But so many ex-Mormons believe that Solomon Spaulding wrote the Book of Mormon, and all that says is that they aren't historians and they don't know. And even though they're understanding of themselves is that they have done this research and their eyes are open and they're thinking about it, it shows that they haven't. In other words, that they have bought into a bunch of post-Mormon narratives, and that's one of the ones that came along with it, and it proves that they don't have that discernment. And so I'm sorry that Bart Ehrman is facing that opposition from what I consider to be a pop idea that I think atheists would be very well to just dump. It doesn't buy you anything. The reality is that most of the text of the New Testament is not historical, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a historical Jesus. It's a very complicated idea, and so this is why people short-circuit it and come to this popular idea, which has the disadvantage of being false. So Sphinx 4 says, Ecclesiastes 3:2-1 says, "Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of beast goes down to the earth? But didn't Jews only believe in Sheol at this time?" So this was that. This is that quote. We were talking about Ecclesiastes earlier, and I absolutely misquoted this in terms of a paraphrase. I said, "Who knows if dogs go to heaven and humans don't," or that kind of a thing. In other words, what is it, if there's an immortal soul, it's all vanity. Don't worry about it. So yeah, this is later, and so this is wisdom tradition, and so this Ecclesiastes is not actually saying that there is necessarily going to be an immortality for man. The author of Ecclesiastes, I think, is saying, we can't know that, and probably isn't going to happen. There probably is no immortality. But no, the idea of it is Ecclesiastes is a later wisdom text, and so this popularization of a soul that continues, that's especially a Greek idea, has been becoming popular in the culture. And likewise, the Zoroastrian idea that maybe your soul will rest for a while, but then you'll be resurrected, that is also becoming new. So the author of Ecclesiastes is holding the more traditional view, which is that there is no immortality, but this is a new idea that the person is responding to and saying that you keep saying that your soul is going to live on forever, but who knows if that's true? In fact, it's not, according to the author of Ecclesiastes' view, I think. Son Gabriel asks, why was Henotheism introduced? Why were they trying to centralize? So this is the idea that the Iron Age kingdom of Israel and later the Iron Age kingdom of Judah, as they are, before in the First Temple period, they are introducing essentially a henotheism. You're only going to worship Yahweh. We're not going to worship all the other gods that we've been worshiping. And in terms of centralizing, we'll only do that at the religious centers. So the kingdom of Israel at Bethel and at Dan and at Samaria, and then in or the temple. There's not a temple yet, but anyway, the holy site in Mount Gerizim, and same thing then later in the kingdom of Judah, only at the Jerusalem temple. So it's part of a trend that is happening of all of these kingdoms. So one of the things that's happening is there is becoming centralization. So even biblically, there is a memory of a tribal period, which is to say smaller kingdoms. A kingdom is really just a bigger tribe, and so like a chief is just a tiny king. And so now having a kingdom around Jerusalem, it's still a pretty tiny kingdom realistically. But now it's considered itself to be a kingdom. So as you're centralizing, part of the things that's allowing you to centralize is that you now have a bigger chief who you're calling a king. And they have a royal court, and they have all of these other things that you're doing institutionally to have that. And same thing, you have a central shrine that has now a high priest, who's not just like all the little priests that had always been around with all the tribes. And so, it's like you're saying, why were they trying to centralize? I would say that this is a chicken and the egg thing, which is centralizing is happening, and in the process of centralizing, you are also centralizing the religion because that's one of the tools that is used to create the centralization. Wow. So Mike asks, how long do you want to go tonight? We have 40 or so questions remaining. Wow, I'm surprised. This is great. It's 9:30. How long does it mean we've been going? 2 hours? 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours? That's amazing. Well, we'll keep going for another half an hour at least, right? So we'll keep going for half an hour. That's 3 hours. That's a marathon. You guys will all be okay with that, right? If we only, so we maybe stop at 10? So Mike is going to have to do some triage. So, I apologize. I appreciate. Had no idea that we were going to be able to go this long. So, E-Beam asks, a lecture comparing the different cultural regions in Star Trek to the real world would be intriguing, like the Vulcans, the Klingons, the Bajorans. But that's just the Trekkie in me. Yeah. Well, I mean, in that sense, so when you have fiction, one of the ways that people are only able to envision things so well, and so you have to kind of use actual history and cultures in order to make them. And so there's all kinds of different warrior cultures that have had their stuff appropriated in order for Star Trek writers to, for example, make Klingons by whether it's samurai and Vikings and different things like that are kind of pulled together in order to find that. But yeah, that would be interesting and fun to do. Andre Moret asks, how would you compare Paul and James and Jesus with the McDonald's brothers and Ray Kroc? In a sense, in both cases, someone appeared to expand the initial idea worldwide. It's a very interesting analogy. I like that. I mean, Ray Kroc got, didn't he? I'm sorry, not Ray Kroc. The McDonald's brothers, didn't they at least get a licensing fee? So I think that's. I'm not sure that James got. Well, I guess he did because Paul was taking up a big contribution from all his churches in order to give money to the poor of Jerusalem as a way to kind of pay James off. So maybe it's a really good analogy. It's a fun analogy anyway. Videos for Stuff asks, probably mostly unlisted, what are your opinions on free will? Is it real? Is it fake? Is it a meaningful question at all? We have done a whole lecture on free will. It is very complicated. It is so I like to believe in free will as because that's what I would choose to believe, but it is a complicated question, and ultimately, for me, tracking down, well, what is a mechanism of free will, and what are you even meaning by the mechanism of an actual choice? You're identifying where a choice is being made over and above all of everything that went before, is complicated to justify how it could be real. It is a meaningful question. It's a very meaningful question because if there is no free will, then it's also you certainly can't have any justification, for example, for moral punishment. You can only have punishment that is preventative. In other words, preventing someone who is a harm from harming society, but they can't be blamed for it because there is no free will. So it is a meaningful question, and it's a very difficult one. Eric, and one I want to believe in, so I do want to believe there is free will, and so I do. I operate from that perspective, but I have to acknowledge that that's a tough one. Eric Nordquist says, does anyone speculate if Joseph Smith Jr.'s brother's death without baptism affected his theology regarding temple ordinances for the dead? Yes. So Joseph Smith had an older brother, Alvin, who had been very important in the family and also to him, and they were very troubled by his kind of death. He died young, in part due to a medical mistreatment. There wasn't good medical science, and died. And so that's very troubling to the family, an untimely death. It's one thing when someone dies at good old age, but to die kind of like in the high point of your life was very troubling. And so because Joseph Smith later decided that there hadn't been true true church on the face of the earth, and that the sacraments, the ordinances that he was authorized to do, like baptism, were actually necessary for exaltation or salvation, maybe even, but not exaltation, that it wouldn't make any sense or be fair if people had lived and died before the opportunity was there to have that. And so that definitely affected his theology. This is a theology that I reject. I don't think that that's, I don't think that things are literally meaningful in that sort of cosmic sense, in terms of any kind of a human action that we do, that you have to, if you don't get this check mark, that's all it takes. That is not my perspective, but it definitely was Joseph Smith's. Jeff Bybee asks, do you agree with the Roman Catholic imposition of celibacy was to make sure the material goods acquired by the church were not being kept by families of the bishops and other clerics? So I think that that was a huge motivation for the church to actually impose that. So be aware that in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic tradition, not in the Orthodoxy, the Latin West, clerics, celibacy was imposed by clerics, and it only happened in the Middle Ages. It's only in the central Middle Ages, after Gregorian reform, that the church was actually able to make that happen. And prior to that, what would happen is that a priest or an abbot of a monastery would get married, and they'd have a kid, and they'd have their son become the next priest. And so that would be an inheritance that would go down in the family. That would be commonly done in the same way that in like a kingdom, if a king sends an official, originally you send an official called your companion, the companion of the king or the emperor, which in Latin is comes, which becomes the word count. That companion is originally just an officer of the king and can be called back. But over time, what happens is that the count has a son, the count's son becomes the count. Then the king isn't in charge anymore, really. In other words, and so that was a thing that was always lapsing, was royal authority. By the time we get to the Central Middle Ages, when we're dealing with the Plantagenets, Henry II fighting against Louis VII, there is the King of France has almost no control over his vassals, because they have been made hereditary vassals. And the same thing was happening in the church. So in order to actually have the church be a coherent institution, celibacy was a way to make that work. And so that's why we have in the church what you call nepotism. Nepos is Latin for nephew, and so nephewism. So when you don't have any sons anymore, you give things to your nephews. So nepotism. So it doesn't always work, celibacy. So anyway, that's why, though. I agree with you. So Stace, England. If the Book of Mormon is mostly no longer used in Community of Christ practice, why is it still part of the official documents? Well, I would just say that actually a huge component of our Bible is no longer in use. So I would say that in Community of Christ, so my experience as a pastor, we are just continuously quoting from the Gospels. So the 4 Gospels are really important. We'll read a little bit from the book of Acts. We go back to the Psalms. There's, people will pull quotes out of Paul and some of the other New Testament books and so on. I don't think it's very common at all that anybody's busy preaching out of the book of Revelation, for example. Almost none of just little quotes over here and there out of the prophetic works. Certainly Psalms get quoted a lot. But what I would say is that there's a whole bunch of Old Testament books that we don't use either. And nobody's reading out of the Song of Solomon, for example, for sure, and just a lot of it. So, why is it still part? It's part of our canon, it's part of our heritage. The same exact tools of discernment and scholarship can be applied to the Book of Mormon as can be applied to any of the biblical texts. And so I'm not really in favor of deleting texts out of the canon, and I think that represents trying to think that making the Bible or the scriptures into something they're not, trying to make them be some kind of perfect thing, and instead of understanding them as being the human response to the divine that are necessarily filled with the limitations of their human authors, be they prophets, evangelists, psalmists, sages, scribes, and so forth. Wednesday Jones asks, in what ways did Joseph Smith's politics affect the Book of Mormon? So the Book of Mormon is written at this time in the young American Republic, when the United States was a very new constitutional democracy republic that had hardly existed any example of that. So largely in any kind of sizable country, everything has always been a monarchy. There had been little city-states, that had been republics and things like that, like Venice or something like that, but not big countries. And so people were very nervous that there would be a revolution where you would establish a new monarchy. And so, for example, at the time, there's a popular general, Andrew Jackson, and a lot of people thought, well, maybe Jackson was going to be the head of a new monarchy, and also that maybe part of that would be accomplished through the fact that he's part of the Freemasons, a secret confraternity that people were very nervous about because they had, secret things. And so the Book of Mormon is filled with that kind of stuff. So there's stories about the kingmen who were trying to overthrow the republic that is taking place in the Book of Mormon. There's secret combinations that are like the Freemasons that are going to overthrow things. And so Joseph Smith's politics at the time find their way into the Book of Mormon narrative up and down the whole narrative. There's a great study of this by Dan Vogel called Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet, which is talks about it at length. Very, very important study. Dynamar Villalobos asks, first off, thank you so much for your support. Dynamar says, greetings from Brazil. Without Plato and Greek philosophy, what would be the Jewish Christian view about eternal life? It is impossible to speculate. The reason why is that it's too influential. So Plato and Greek philosophy are at the heart of the Jewish and Christian, especially Christian, view about eternal life. Certainly Second Temple Jewish and modern Christian view about eternal life. And so without Plato and Greek philosophy, the whole thing would be totally different. So maybe, I guess here's what we would speculate, is that we would have instead, we'd only have the Zoroastrian idea, and so then we would really be focused not on there being a soul or a spirit, an immaterial spirit inside you, but rather that we are fully wedded to our bodies, and so there would be a much bigger emphasis on resurrection. And so the idea would be you're not having really any existence until a literal end of the world when a trumpet happens, the world is destroyed, and people are bodily resurrected, which is the Zoroastrian idea. So Joshua Valdez says, is the rapture biblical? No. So the rapture is a 19th century innovation that is based on misreading the Bible. So when people people look at the Bible as if it was all one thing, and they take little verses out of multiple different books, and then they read them together, then they create ideas that none of the authors have as an intent. And so there are scriptures within texts like Luke, where it says something like, two people will be lying in bed, and the Lord, will take one, or something like that. And there is no reason to imagine that has anything to do with this modern idea of the rapture. It's like it's what it's saying is people be lying by dead, and this guy's going to die. And it's, in other words, this is one of the things that we don't know. You can't know from day to day, if what's going to happen, in terms of the future. There is all kinds of uncertainty. It's not talking about a rapture event. That is a modern hypothesis or doctrine that's been made up, that has been built, using those proof text quotes out of context in order to create the idea. Elizabeth Bosselman says, John, have you ever talked about your thoughts on the changes of religious education or maybe historiography over time. I don't know that I've had anything like that. I haven't done a lecture on, let's say, modern developments in religious education or historiography. I mean, there's been a huge amount of evolution of historiography. So back a century ago, is this era of positivist historians where historians literally thought that they were going to be able to just write like the history of the Roman Empire, and then they would be done with it because they will have done all of everything that you need for a history book, and then that part will be done, and then somebody can go on and write the Hittite history and so on. But what they were only doing at the time was writing a very narrow political, institutional, maybe a little bit of economic history that is focused only on the elite and the state and things like that. And so there was nothing like, what were women doing? What was 99% of the population, the common people, doing? There was nothing on that kind of a thing. And so it took a whole revolution of historians and historiography in order to create ideas like social history to reconstruct all of those things. And so over time, there's been a significant evolution. Also, just even understanding, there's now an understanding that part of the job of the historian is to actually translate things to our own era. And so the history that was written in the early, like Gibbon's The Fall of the Roman Empire, he's translating it to his own audience centuries and centuries ago. And so the things that he's saying to explain the past to his own day, well, his own day is a long time ago, and so we needed translation to just get it to what people perceive now. There's so many different paradigms and prism of perspective that has so changed that when you read Gibbon, you're not understanding him without annotation, without footnotes anymore. So I haven't done a whole lecture on it, but there's a little preview of what it would look like. Chaba Morosi asks, while the Bible has many authors over a long time, the Quran has only one. Does it make it easier for Muslims to fall into literalism since it has fewer contradictions? Could this be one of the reasons for Islamic fundamentalism? It could be, I would say. It doesn't, but it doesn't have to. So I think that part of the issue is that there does need to be, so there's several issues for Islam and where it's at. So Islam, unfortunately, like in the age of imperialism, largely Muslim countries found themselves on the being colonized end of the stick, where Europeans were the colonizers. And that has caused a bunch of different setbacks, and one of those setbacks was that when the imperial controller, and then later the, let's say, like a secular dictator that is being able to stay in power because of weapons that he's getting from the West and things like that, like Saddam Hussein or something like that, when you're doing that, the only institution that isn't controlled is the religion, and that caused a growth of the religion, but in a very popular way. And so I think there's a lot of things in short that contributed to a rise of fundamentalism within Islam, to the point where there's a huge rise of fundamentalism in Christianity, as we keep talking about, which is a mess, but it's even a bigger issue in Islam. And so Islam definitely, there is progressive Islam, but it is much more a minority, and what there really is needed is religious leaders who are informed by very authentic scholarship. And when that happens, it doesn't actually matter that the Quran is dated to one particular time, because there's all kinds of reasons why you have to take a more sophisticated understanding of it when you accept academic reality, when you accept scrutiny of it. That it doesn't matter how many authors there would be. because of the different contradictions. So the idea that some sects of Islam, a big component of the Sunnis, consider the Quran to be uncreated, that it actually exists eternally with God, but it's written in medieval Arabic, which is something that existed, in terms of a development. It only existed to one point in time in history, and so it's ultimately a preposterous coincidence or whatever, or absurd thing for God to do, and so a more sophisticated, progressive Muslim communities would be able to understand the Quran in those kind of lenses the same way that Reformed Christians, Reformed Jews do. Videos for Stuff said, when would you say The Simpsons started going downhill? I don't like anything past season 10. For me, the Jump the Shark episode is where, what I hated was that suddenly all the celebrities started showing up in Springfield. And so there's a moment when Homer says, Alec Baldwin, Kim Basinger, Ron Howard, what are you doing in Springfield? And so I think you're right that that's season 10, and I consider that to be the Jump the Shark episode, the Jump the Shark moment. Mike says when Phil Hartman died, that's when it went. That's the end for him. George says, I'm curious, as someone who also finds history interesting and rewarding as a subject of study, what motivated John's interest in history? It's hard to say because I have been interested in history since I was a very little kid. I will admit so I have a bunch of different interests, and one of them is also maps. So I've also always been an artist, and I did a lot of illustration. I've done professional illustration for presses and things like that as a career in the past. And so when I was a little kid, I just drew all the time. And and I would draw maps too. And one of the things that I had as one of my favorite books, I don't know, like as a 4 or 5 year old, was the Hammond Atlas of World History. And I would go through that, and I would just look at all of the history of like all the European countries, and I would have no idea what any of them are. And like a lot of people are critical of the way I pronounce things even to this day, but I had no idea how to pronounce anything because I just read it off. And so I would look at this, and I would say, why would the Holy Roman Empire be not in the same? Why would the boundaries of it cut out the papal states? Of course, because I didn't know to say papal. But anyway, so I would question about that. I was very interested in the development through historical maps, and that fueled, I think, my interest in history. Because, like I said, I was looking at that. That was a very important book to me. Like when I was 5, even. That's when I first started playing with that book, or had that book. Videos for Stuff asks, do you think the idea that Christ is God was something contemporary to his life from a few years after, from a century or two after? It's from not contemporary to his life. It is from, though, just a few years after. I mentioned how Paul has a very advanced Christology, very soon after Jesus' death. And so it's not that you can't have a really advanced Christology and even start, to the mythicist position. You can. There's all kinds of myths that are being created about Jesus very soon after his death, but that doesn't. But it wasn't contemporary, and it didn't take a century or two for people to start to look at Christ as God. Mercury Wells, what are John's thoughts about Christ's divinity? Was he born that way, or did he reach a level of holiness after baptism as symbolized by the dove? So I separate between the Christ of theology, the Christ of Scripture, and the Jesus of history. The Jesus of history inspired the Christian understanding of God, but our understanding of God, which has evolved over time, is that we see God through a prism of three. So we see God through the Creator, the Parent, the Logos, Christ, and the Spirit. And so Christ is eternally divine. So the Logos is divine. So always that way. And in terms of the baptism and the symbolism of the dove, that is the sacred story, and that's how we talk about Christ as God. But that's separate from the historical Jesus, who, I was just saying in the previous question, would not have thought he was God and would not have had any of his contemporaries think so until after his death. Elaine says, John, I am a beginner in the study of Latter-day Saints movement. What would you say are the Restoration distinctives retained by Community of Christ today? So we mentioned a couple times in this already that we have our scripture, so the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. A Restoration distinctive that we have, that the Mormons don't have, is that we are continually having new revelation. So we add stuff to Scripture all the time. So we have new sections of our book of Scripture, the Doctrine and Covenants. That's a distinctive of Latter-day Saint movement. Certainly our organizational structure. So the fact that my priesthood office here is called that I am a 70. That is definitely part of the distinctives. I mean, certainly the idea of 70 comes from the New Testament. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, but it's only in the Latter-day Saint tradition churches that anybody would have a priesthood office of being called into a council or a quorum of 70 the way I am. We have a lot of other things that are part of our DNA. The difference between us and some of the other, all the other traditions pretty much within the Restoration are just this idea of literalism. And so we're seeing things meaningfully as opposed to literally is how I would frame it. John Phelps says, how fluent are you in Latin and what is your favorite Latin work? So my fluency used to be a lot better. So I took a lot of Latin. So I was, took 4 years of Latin in high school, and I was president of the Latin club, and I took Latin in college and in graduate school. The book that I spent a lot of time with in a graduate school, I did a translation of the Cana Cypriani, which is the feast of Cyprian. It's not really written by Cyprian, it's pseudo-Cyprian. It was a book that has a major element in the novel by Umberto Eco called The Name of the Rose, which is just my favorite novel of all times. And so a major plot element is this book that is a parody of the Bible, a parody of Scripture that was passed around by the monks, and they all loved it, and they would laugh at it and things like that, and it was seen as irreverent because here it's a satirizing of the Scriptures, and it had never been translated into English. And as a graduate project, I translated that and annotated it. I like that as a Latin work. It's one I spent a lot of time with. I already recommended as the book everybody should read. The Consolation of Philosophy, which is a Latin book. I haven't actually read it in Latin, though, so it would be unfair of me to use that one. Trying to think of other things that I've read. So I've read in Latin a bunch of different medieval historians, like Walter Map, the Nuggets, the Venerable Bede, has this great Latin stuff. It's been a while, though. I don't go straight to the text in Latin anymore because it's very rusty for me. Fastball Flakes. Knowing that the Book of Mormon is not historical, as a map maker, I wonder what John sees as the most interesting, cool Book of Mormon geography hypothesis. So the hypothesis, I don't agree with these. So there's Book of Mormon doesn't say where it is exactly being, but in my opinion, the Book of Mormon assumes a hemispheric explanation. And so I think that all the different modern theories that Book of Mormon literalists have for trying to place the Book of Mormon onto a map, whether it's in Florida or in the area around the Great Lakes or in the Yucatan or anything like that, those are all misreadings of the text. When I was a little kid, I made a map of the Book of Mormon, and it takes the whole North and South America, and that's how the text was meant. But it is obviously not a history. Okay, so Mike tells me the next is a lightning round. I am supposed to answer each one of these questions in 60 seconds or less, because we're running out of time, right? Yeah, oh my goodness. This is so much fun. Okay, so Mercury Well says, is John aware of the academic work of Brian Murarescu? And if so, what are his views on the idea that the pre-Constantine church might have had a psychedelic sacrament? So I know that all of this idea of psychedelics has become really exciting for everybody, and I think that everybody, there's ideas that Joseph Smith and the early Mormons are all doing psychedelics and all this kind of thing. I think that what I think about all of these are, yes, it's completely possible, but I think that all of these are drawn from the fact that modern people have so little imagination, and we are so dependent on our screens for any kind of vision, that we think that the only way that you are able to be in a visionary state is that if you have psychedelics, because we don't have the patience and the imagination and the capacity to channel inspiration in that way anymore. So I think it's a popular thing that people have been coming up with. I'm not opposed to the idea if you have good data for it. Elk of Antioch says, I'm dying to ask a scholar who could actually answer this. Did Robert E. Howard, when constructing his Atlantean mythos, make any use of any ancient stories from the period he depicts? I haven't read Robert E. Howard, so I'm sorry, Elk, I can't answer that. I've only got a minute for each one of these. Leandro Palacios asks, my natural time zone is the middle of the Atlantic. Does that prove the existence of Atlantis? So that's two Atlantis ones in a row. Let me just say, Plato invented the idea of Atlantis. There was no Atlantis. Atlantis is a myth. So regardless of what everybody likes to find Atlantis. Aristotle said everybody's been looking for Atlantis ever since Plato started talking about it. Plato made it up. And that's the way it is. Eric Nordquist says, are there any possible historical origins for the story of Luke 5:17 through 26? Specifically, the author claims teachers have gathered from every village and Judea and Jerusalem. So I don't know the rest of the story that you're talking about, but if you're saying essentially that Jesus is gathering a movement from every village and Judea and Jerusalem, it wouldn't be every single one in any kind of literalistic sense. The author of Luke doesn't have, is not a first-hand witness and isn't from Judea, Jerusalem, or Galilee, and so the authors of these Gospels, a significant portion of this is not historical in any way, and so that my rule of thumb for everybody who's reading different gospel stuff, if you're worried about it, is just assume it's not historical, but there's a historical Jesus, but not these things that we're reading about didn't necessarily happen. Kelly Higgins, can you speak a bit on the Fisher King and the origin of the legend and its connection to Christianity, for instance? I can't. We're getting to the lightning round I'm not doing very good on. So I don't know that answer. Jeffroli Evertinitz asks, can someone tell me when the presentation on the River Styx is? We're probably not going to do a deep dive on the River Styx only. Is the River Styx the one that that's the one, not the one that we jump into, we'll forget. But in any event, it's not going to be enough for us to do that. We have done some Greek mythology ones, and so it might be interesting in an afterlife lecture in general that we would bring up the River Styx. Sandra Byrne asks, okay, I have to ask, if I were to say to you, wibbledy bobbledy, would you know what follows? Wibbledy wobbledy, wibbly wobbly. I would guess that you're maybe making a Harry Potter reference, so I have not read any of the Harry Potter books, and I've only seen the first movie, but I don't even know that I watched it all the way through. So I'm sorry to tell you, I don't know a lot about it, if so. Sorry. And if I'm not, I'm assuming that that's what that is, but I don't know. Art of Alchemy asks, was Noah an albino? There is nothing in the text that would, in my opinion, that would suggest that Noah is an albino. And the only thing that we can say about Noah is what is in the text, because Noah is not a historical figure. It's someone who we know from the text. PQM Construction says, with all the research in your cornucopia of knowledge, have you looked into the simulation theory? If so, what do you think? And so I'm presuming that is, I just would guess, where are we in the matrix? In other words, does it make sense that, in other words, that we can't tell what all of this is real, or maybe we're operating within a simulation? So I think that this is one of the ideas that arises because we have computers and simulations and things like that, in the same way that in the past, the reason why, for example, in the Wizard of Oz, artificial people are made out of like a tin mechanical men because they had mechanical stuff, and now we think of ourselves as not mechanically because we're no longer focused on mechanics, and we instead think of ourselves as computers. So what I think is that a lot of cases when we are given a new thing, that we can't help but anthropomorphize it, and we think of ourselves in the terms of the thing. Eric Bernardin says, was Josephus the last man at Masada? No. But it's interesting. So Josephus, supposedly, he said he was the last man at a different, similar kind of suicide cult thing. And so that he is when he's captured, not Masada, so years before that, and before he switches sides, he's part of a suicide pact, and he's able to get it down to the last two guys or something like that, and then he's able to convince the second to last guy, well, neither one of them really needs to kill each other, and we can just go over to the Roman side, I think is how it goes. And so that makes a mathematical problem that mathematicians have had to kind of solve. How do you set it up so that all the people you want to die in the suicide pact die first, so that you can end up being alive? And then what happens is that Josephus tells a very similar story again for Masada, and so it actually calls the historicity of the Masada story itself into question, since again Josephus isn't the most reliable narrator, and he is our main source for the Masada story. So anyway, I haven't looked into the rest of the archaeological. There's obviously Masada existed and so on, but the story of it with the suicide pact is surprisingly close to the other story that Josephus says. Macklin Castick says, what is your opinion on Quakerism? Are you going to make any lecture about it in the future? My opinion is that Quakers are great, and I have some, the head of the Quaker meeting here in Toronto I've known for a while, because we're both delegates to the Canadian Council of Churches. The Quakers are amazing in terms of their commitment to nonviolence, to social justice. I probably may do a lecture on Quakerism and other maybe movements like that in the future. I don't have any plans on it anytime soon. So for me, I can't be a Quaker because their main meeting is they get together in a circle and everybody sits in silence and things, and I find that to be really boring. That's not how I commune with the divine. I appreciate it as a spiritual practice, but it's not my thing. So, but I appreciate them. The flagged YouTuber says, why is the Gospel of Thomas considered a sayings gospel when it has narrative to it? Because it's primarily sayings. There are some narrative elements, like you say. A lot of cases, the narrative elements are just to set up a saying. But this is also true for the sayings gospel Q. So there are stories in it. And so a lot of times I will get to a place where I'll be like reading a little story in Luke, and I will see that same little story is in Matthew, and then I'll see, wait a second, that story is not in Mark. And then I realize, oh, wait a second, if I go to the Q, the International my book that has Q printed, then it's like, oh, well, this is identified as a narrative, actually a narrative element in the Q sayings gospel. And so it's suggesting that we shouldn't take this absolutely. It's called a sayings gospel because it's consisting and values primarily sayings, but there is some narrative to it, just like Q. Likewise, Mark is our first narrative gospel, but it includes sayings of Jesus. So it's a general category, not an absolute category. Michael Rogers says, random, have you seen the movie Book of Clarence? New movie, Book of Clarence. My opinion is it's a surprisingly good movie. I have not seen it. I have not seen a lot of new movies, so I'll take that as a recommendation and I will look it up. Anita Coleman says, Sphinx, didn't Mithraism come before Zoroastrianism? Nope. What? Oh, never mind. Okay, we're getting down to the last five. Number 5, Rhonda Dearborn. Will John do an in-depth lecture focused on Emma Smith? I could. Emma Smith is an important leader. So Emma Smith was the wife of the founding prophet Joseph Smith, and she ends up being, her and her children are the nucleus for Community of Christ. And so she is a very interesting figure, pioneering leader in our church. The problem, Rhonda, in terms of that is, anytime I do lectures on restoration topics, they get way fewer views, so a lot of the audience don't want those as much. Number 4, and otherwise I do it. I like Emma Smith. Number four question to the last question, fourth to the end. Run and Shoot asks, can you do a lecture on Marcion? I might be able to. So Marcion is interesting. We are doing. I kind of have started a series of the kind of the earliest Christianities, and I've already done. I've got on the schedule the Pauline Church and the Jamesian Church, and so it does make sense to do Marcion and the Marcionites. Number 3 to the end, the third to last one, Coke in America asks, John, have you ever read Harold Bloom's Jesus and Yahweh, the Names Divine? If not, I would recommend it. I have read Harold Bloom's, several of Harold Bloom's essays, and certainly the Book of J, and his, which is his interpretations and his essays reflecting on the Yahwist source and the documentary hypothesis. I haven't read Jesus and Yahweh, the Names Divine, and it does sound very interesting. So I thank you for that recommendation. Alan Young says, do you think Emanuel Swedenborg had an influence on Joseph Smith? So I don't know that there is a direct influence. What Emanuel Swedenborg has some ideas that are in the mix, like, so for example, I think it's in Afterlife, the idea that there might be 3 degrees of glory, which ends up in Joseph Smith's theology or cosmology. And so it's ideas that are in the mix. I don't know that Joseph Smith has actually read anything from Swedenborg directly, but it could be. John Phelps says, do you think Jesus had a good sense of humor, i.e., render unto Caesar pieces of metal with his picture on it? Yeah, I mentioned the name of the rose. And so this whole fight is between whether laughter is of God or laughter is of the devil, and William of Baskerville, who's the kind of the hero of this, has to kind of defend the idea that that Christ made jests, because the villain of the story, the Venerable Jorge, says Christ never laughed, and William says that there are so many clever things that Jesus says that is a kind of humor. So you can make, William also says that you can make the case for both. All right, so there's a late edition. So Sean Hogan, thank you for your support. He says, I'm late. Anyone ask about Acts 24? Paul is accused of being Nazarene, but says he follows the way. Why aren't John the Baptist the way? When did Jesus get of Nazareth as a title? So Jesus so there's multiple attestation for Jesus as being of Nazareth. So this is one of the things that I think most all historians agree is one of the characteristics of the historical Jesus that has multiple attestation, that is also has the criterion of embarrassment. In other words, all of the early Christians would like Jesus to have been born in Bethlehem. He's not. He's from Nazareth, and so of Nazareth is everybody's named something like Jesus. It's a common name in Judea and Galilee, and so he's identified with his location name. And so the problem with Nazarene, I have to look at Acts. I'm not sure here what it is. So Nazarene itself becomes kind of a title for followers of Jesus, but it also is confusing to a lot of people because there's also this unrelated. I think it's called Naziri. In other words, it's an unrelated type of ascetic that is from the Old Testament. That Samson is one. In other words, where you don't cut your hair and you don't do certain things in order to dedicate yourself to God, and that confuses people. So the real origin for Jesus of being from Nazareth is he's from that town. Two final thoughts to close. Han Thomas says, a major thing I got from these lectures is that stories don't need to be historical to be meaningful. So Robin Hood or A Christmas Carol are just stories, but they're hugely important and meaningful. Thank you. And Thomas, that is, hopefully I am presenting that all the time. I'm not ever here to debunk when I say, well, the Exodus is not historical or something like that. It's not to debunk, it's so that we can understand these stories meaningfully instead of worrying about just literalism and the meaninglessness of just something that happened to happen. And finally, Unrecognized Talent asks, why can't these lectures be longer? Well, I've been standing this whole time. What time is it? It's 10, 11, 3 hours and 11 minutes. I'm not as young as I used to be. I appreciate all of this. What a wonderful evening. I loved all these questions. And you stumped me with a few of them, folks. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. There are 16 questions left in the queue. We're going to have to let these go and say goodnight. Good night, everybody. Next week, we're going to talk about Paul and why Paul's church won.